Usually they mark off at least half of these or possibly more. Those include that the disappearance happened.
Alright, fellers, so we're back for stream. Not really. Um, so today, right now, we're gonna be kind of going into. This might be a little long video, but we're gonna be going into like what are 411 cases, because I've been finding them fascinating. Like what they are, and just go into them, dude. Let's do this shit.
Near water, near a boulder field, or a large supply of granite. There are often berry shrubs around. There will often be sudden weather changes. Dogs will not be able to pick up the scent. The person goes missing at one elevation and appears at a radically different elevation,
Yeah, that shit is
2,000,
creepy.
3,000 feet up a mountain. In many cases, the disappearing parties are children, such as Garrett Bardsley or Dennis Martin. And when the people are found deceased, there is no discernible cause of death in almost every single case. So, what exactly is going on? What's causing this? There are a lot of possibilities. Now, we can't rule out some of the more simple ones. Yes, the teams that are investigating and compiling these cases for the books and movies that discuss them are actually looking for signs of foul play. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to catch them. It could be that the person who committed a kidnapping or a murder was just very good at hiding the evidence. That is always a possibility, but if that seems likely, these cases don't really get investigated. If there seems to be motive for somebody to actually take on the individual who disappears, then it's the police's responsibility. That's not the job of private investigators like Paulides. And in many of these cases, what you have is people who simply disappear. For example, the case of Paul LeMay. This is a guy who was running the Mount Marathon race in Alaska. He got to the top of the mountain, saw the people who were in charge of timing the race. They basically were like, yeah, he's cool, you're okay, just make sure you get down the mountain safely. And he was never seen again. So despite the fact that he was seen just moments before reaching the point at which he would turn around and come back down the mountain, hours later they couldn't find him. They combed the entire mountain, the surrounding areas, and there was no trace. His family was there waiting for him. He had no signs of suicidal ideation, nor did he express any intent to disappear or leave his life behind, and yet he was just gone.
Yeah, that's
Another
odd.
good case is the case of Chris Tompkins, who went missing while on a surveying trip with a crew of 3 other men. He was at the back of the line, and the man in front of him would look back, make sure he was there every few minutes, and they'd keep marching along their trail. But one of the times that one of his buddies looked back, Chris had disappeared, and all that was left where he was one of his boots caught up in a barbed wire fence, his keys and some spare change that had fallen out of his pocket, and several hundred yards away, his other boot. And nothing, not a trace of his body or his belongings were ever found again. There were no tracks, there was no blood trail, no sign of a struggle. He simply just vanished. And then there's a case of Garrett Bardsley, who went missing in a boulder field near a lake. These are, of course, numerous things that all check off missing 411 profile points. Near boulder field, near water, child. One of his socks had fallen off, so that checks the missing clothing box. Dogs could not find a scent for him, and as far as anyone could tell, he
I think we covered this one, chat.
So when it comes to these cases that really have no rational, reasonable explanation, that's when you have to start looking into supernatural or possibly preternatural phenomenon. Now, I'm not saying that that's just the first thing you should ever go to when something mysterious happens, but when lacking any other conceivable reasons for someone's disappearance, that's kind of the only thing you can do. And we've compiled a few possibilities for what's going on here.
Like
One of the
speculating
most
for
commonly
aliens.
suggested ones, if you go on the internet forums and look at this stuff, is alien abduction.
Of course.
And while I personally am not a believer in space aliens, they do bring up several good points. These people go missing completely out of the blue. There is no discernible trail of human markers that could explain what happened. Human beings, even if we are taking something from the air, it's loud, it's noisy. Even if you were to fly a helicopter in somewhere, throw a rope down, slide down it, grab somebody and pick them back up, in the time it would take you to do that, everyone around would notice that it was happening. So it can't be that. So perhaps something with super stealth capabilities and a tractor beam could actually pull somebody up into a spacecraft. Now, there have been lots of stories, especially in the United States and Canada, of alien abductions. I personally don't find many of them all that compelling, but a lot of people do, and it's a pretty common suggestion for this type of thing. One of the more mundane suggestions is that there are feral people living in the national parks, and this is something that was brought up by the
Feral
TV
people.
show American Horror Stories about 6 months after I started talking about this on the internet. I see what you did, American Horror Stories, and I want my credit. The idea here is that there were either missing hikers or Confederate Civil War veterans who went off into the wilderness, people who got stranded along the Oregon Trail, Native American tribes that were especially primitive and savage who practiced things like cannibalism. And of course, that's not to suggest in any way that this is something common, or this is not supposed to stereotype Native Americans at all. I'm just giving you the story behind what people suggest may have happened. Now, as far as the concept of feral people living in the national parks goes, I think that's one of the more reasonable conspiracy theories out there. It is not entirely unbelievable that human beings who go off the grid for a long time might come back and be different. It's genuinely a very possible thing, and we've seen situations such as the Donner Party with, I believe it was Louis Keseberg, who he was out on his own for just a couple of weeks and committed acts of cannibalism, and it took him a long time to reintegrate into society. So if somebody can go mad that quickly, it's believable that several generations could see distinct changes from normal human social codes. Now, the problem with the feral people explanation is that it would usually show signs of a struggle. If somebody was
eating people,
being abducted by feral people while with others, it would be a very obvious commotion. Now, somebody going missing alone, that could possibly be a feral people situation. And in certain cases, for example, Charles McCuller, that would make more sense. People who were off doing their own thing alone in the woods and eventually disappeared and were found dead. So if it's a case of a lone person, feral people is a possibility. But a lot of these cases, the majority of these cases, the person is not alone. So what does that leave? Well, there's a few more possibilities. One of those is that these people are being abducted by something supernatural. And the Native Americans have a lot of stories about this. If you talk to the Ojibwa or any of the Algonquin groups, what you're going to find is that they believe in a spirit called the Wendigo. And the Wendigo is a demonic entity in some versions of this that takes over a person's body and turns them into a monster that is constantly craving human flesh, that doesn't care for creature comforts, and that is constantly just consumed by its desire to eat human flesh. In other versions of that story, it's not a demonic entity rather than a transformation that you undergo when being a cannibal for reasons of desperation or greed. In both cases, what you're talking about is something that has superhuman hunting abilities. Stealth, super strength, super speed, the ability to mimic voices, but they're also covered in very emaciated, papery skin, so the way to kill them is to light them on fire. Now, why could this be an option? Well, they're known to live in the wilderness, specifically to inhabit caves or mine shafts, and to come out and hunt for food in the winter and when it's cold. Now, some of these cases, of course, don't happen in the winter, but that could just be a storytelling issue. Perhaps over time, the story of the Wendigo just got so associated with the winter that people began to believe it couldn't come out during the summer. But that's not necessarily the case. You could be dealing with a supernatural entity that doesn't follow the rules that we have set out for it. And, that was our mistake. It should be noted at this point that the Wendigo of folklore, of actual Native American folklore, is not the version that you see on the internet all the time.
He's not the voice.
It does not have a deer skull for a head. It is a tall, gaunt, emaciated human being with shallow, sunken eyes, pale skin, and a constant desire to consume human flesh. Now, a kind of cross between this and the feral people idea occurs in the Nahanni National Park Preserve up in the Northwestern Territories of Canada. Now, up here, there are legends from the Native Americans about pale-faced demons that inhabit the valley, and a large number of people who went into that valley for prospecting purposes who ended up dead, headless, with their corpses burned. Now, dead and headless could be a Wendigo. Corpses burned indicates human beings. So, we don't really know what's going on there. But it is strange nonetheless, and we, of course, have videos on everything that I've talked about so far today. One of my personal favorite theories here is something that is probably the most acceptable to the rationally minded, which is that people are disappearing into dimensional rifts. Yes, I did say rationally minded. I know we're making eye contact right now. So my suggestion here actually does have its roots not in science, but in folklore. And as is generally the case,
Here
science
we
is
go.
very slowly catching up to general common knowledge among different indigenous groups from around the world, including the Celts and the Norse and the Native Americans. So what am I suggesting? What am I positing with this dimensional rift theory? Well, a lot of different cultures believed that if you entered cave systems, you could come out in a different place in the world or in time. And considering that all of these disappearances happen around cave systems, near them, usually within a couple miles at the very furthest, it makes sense that, maybe these people went into a cave to get out of the rain or something like that and ended up in a different dimension. Or perhaps some interdimensional being dragged them there. There are a number of possibilities here, but in some cases the dimensional rift theory works, in others not so much. And in most of these cases, it doesn't make a ton of sense why somebody would enter a cave or climb up one of these random staircases in the woods or whatnot. And yes, there are actually random staircases in the woods. I know you think it's a creepypasta, but there are in fact some of them. I'm not saying that all the creepypastas are true. I'm just saying that yes, there are random staircases in the woods that don't seem to have been attached to any building at any point in their history. And yes, that is weird and it is worth being confused about. But at the end of the day, none of these explanations really account for the entirety of the missing 411 phenomenon. And so it only seems fair that we cover this case by case, which is something that we here at the Lore Lodge plan on doing very soon. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.
Yeah, why are there just random staircases in the woods? Maybe I can look that up really quick. Yeah, there probably used to be like a house attached to this. So weird. That's fucking weird.
One of the next tools in our belt is the 411. This is what we put together after we have our GPS. It's going to be the information, the things that we need to complete, the actionable items that we have to get our GPS done. We're going to look at our strategies and see what we need to do to get those things complete. For example, let's say one of the things is that we need to cold call more. We're going to look at our month and say how many calls do we need to make that month? How many do
What the fuck? What did Wendigo say?
Hello everybody, today we are going to begin to break down the mystery of Missing 411. Missing 411 refers to a series of unexplainable disappearances across North America. As we're going to see throughout the series, some of these cases are so bizarre that it's hard to even speculate what could have happened to these people. And yes, I did say series because as you're going to see, this topic is so wide and interesting that this is only the beginning of our...
This week on BuzzFeed Unsolved, we cover
Whatever.
the controversial death of Michelle Von Amster, which may involve one of the most deadly suspects we've ever covered. With that being said, let's get into it. On Friday, April 15th, 1994, in San Diego, California, on Sunset Cliffs, two surfers noticed seagulls perched on top of what appeared to be floating kelp. Upon closer inspection, they noticed that it was in fact the body of Michelle Von Amster floating face down in a kelp bed. It's a pretty beautiful location. Kelpie, but what a terrible thing to have happened in such a beautiful place. Eventually, the body was taken to San Diego Lifeguard headquarters at 4 p.m. Michelle was found naked, wearing only a brass bracelet and 2 rings. She had a butterfly tattoo on her shoulder and had long brown hair. Medical examiner Robert Engel examined the body directly upon arrival to the Lifeguard headquarters and reported, quote, large tearing type wounds with missing tissue, end quote, as the body was missing most of its right leg.
That's a shark, baby. I know, I've seen Jaws at least 6 times. That's a shark.
Well, not so fast.
Huh?
Don't jump to conclusions.
I'm jumping. I've jumped. I've landed.
Said
Shark.
I'm
It's a
jumped.
shark.
Just keep in mind, things may not be what they appear.
Huh?
One thing worthy of note is that he believed Michelle had not been in the water a long time. Although he did not claim a cause of death in his report, the consensus on the boat was that this was most likely a shark attack. One day later, on April 16, 1994, a formal autopsy was performed by San Diego medical examiner Brian Blackburn. Heads up, this is about to get pretty brutal here in
Okay.
this description. I'm saying this because these details will become relevant later, but it's rough. In addition to large tearing type wounds, the right leg was missing from the middle of the thigh down. Her neck was broken, quote, as if she'd been in a car wreck, end quote, and had broken
Jesus.
ribs, scrapes, bruises, and contusions on the face. Sand was found in Von Emster's mouth, throat, lungs, and stomach.
It's too much sand.
That's a lot of sand.
You don't want any sand anywhere.
That's gonna come in big later, so remember
Okay,
that.
All right, I'll remember it. Sand.
Furthermore, the report concluded that Von Amster had been alive when these injuries were inflicted upon her. According to Blackburn, Michelle Von Amster was last seen at 8 p.m., which Blackburn used in establishing his timeline, and placed Michelle in the water at midnight. Blackburn arrived at the conclusion that it was a shark attack because lifeguards, harbor police, and local marine biologists at Scripps Institute told him so. According to him, Michelle was attacked by a great white shark, forcing her to the bottom of the ocean, where she broke her neck and swallowed sand, and then died from blood loss and drowning. And when you briefly look at the details, that seems highly plausible.
No, it doesn't.
So you switch now, you don't think of a
Yeah,
shark.
this is baloney. I'm flip-flopping again.
Let's look at a couple things that don't add up in regards to Michelle dying due to a shark attack. First off, medical examiner Brian Blackburn, the man who concluded it was an attack by a great white, had never seen a death caused by a shark attack before, and neither had anybody who saw the body. The experts that Blackburn consulted with at Scripps Institute never saw the body. Instead, Blackburn came to Scripps Institute himself,
Blackburn.
making the Institute's assessment of Michelle's cause of death questionable, to say the least.
Wait, so he hadn't even seen a death by shark before?
No, so he had never seen a death by a shark attack, and the experts that he conferred with at Scripps Institute, the oceanology,
What?
he didn't bring them in to have them look at the body. He just went over there himself and told them what had happened. That's called being not thorough.
No, not at all.
That's called
Additionally,
fucking
many
half-assed.
experts do not think this was a great white shark attack.
Chingasfari as
including
shit.
Ralph Collier, the leading expert on Pacific Coast white shark behavior and ecology. After seeing the remains of Michelle's leg bone, Collier said, quote, when a white shark bites off part of a limb, the break is clean, almost like you put it on a table saw. What remained of Michelle's femur was anything but. It looked like what happens when you get a piece of bamboo and whittle it down to a point with a knife. I've looked at close to 100 photos of cases that I've reviewed over the years, and I've never seen any bones.
So she
that
didn't
came
get
from
bit by a
the
shark.
End quote.
A little beside the point, but very impressive on the great white shark's behalf that they can do such a clean bite.
Well, it's a powerful animal.
Yeah,
Like
hell yeah.
mangling
It's
on
not a
you.
bear, but it's a
It could
powerful
certainly kill a bear, hands
It
down, if
definitely
you dropped
could-
a bear in the
no,
ocean.
If you,
yeah.
No, if a bear.
No,
We've been over this
no.
before. The bear is the most deadly animal of all time.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not.
If you put a bear in any playing field in the world, water,
Nope,
land,
hippopotamus.
no, fuck you, dude. A bear's
Hippopotamus
the
would
most.
kill
You know
a
what?
bear.
Can't
We're
bears
gonna hide-
fish?
This is a different episode.
Fuck you.
Another thing that seemed strange was the notion that the sand had entered Michelle's body after her leg had been torn off. Quote, the damage would have severed her femoral artery, and she would have bled to death quickly. But for her to have sand in her stomach, she had to take a big gulping breath as she made contact with the sand, end quote. Here's one last thought from Collier. Quote, there are too many things in this case that are not consistent with white shark behavior, end quote.
He's the Richard Dreyfuss of this Jaws story.
Exactly.
Oh
This would be like if
shit!
in
So at least we
Jaws
can
there was a
confirm that
guy
it was
who
an animal,
was
not
very
some
evil, and then
deranged
shark!
human on
And
bath
just toss him in the
salts,
ocean.
Yeah.
going turbo
Dreyfuss
mode or
was like,
something.
this is bullshit.
Another person against the notion of a great white shark attack is Richard Rosenblatt, the chairman of Scripps Institute at the time, who initially consulted with medical examiner Brian Blackburn on the case without seeing Michelle's body. And when actually given the measurements of Michelle's wounds, Rosenblatt said that none of the marks on Michelle's body were caused by a white shark. And furthermore, if she had been bitten by a white shark, they most likely would have found a great white tooth broken off into her body.
Yeah, that is
And
true.
no
That's
great white
sad.
teeth were found inside her body. There were, however, bite marks left by blue sharks, who definitely did feed on Michelle's body. Pathologist Harry Bunnell, who examined the case,
Blue
states that there
shark.
was no evidence these bites occurred before her death. Another medical examiner, Glenn Wagner, re-examined the case in 2008, and also felt that her body had been scavenged by sharks after her death. One final point to disprove the theory of a shark attack is the
Turned
fact
her
that
into a
Michelle's
fucking
leg was
meal.
missing. Here's another quote from Scripps Institute chairman Richard Rosenblatt. Quote, if a shark had taken the leg, it could only have been a white shark, end quote. So, if only a white shark could have taken the leg, and it has been proven unlikely that a white shark was the culprit, then it's reasonable to say that
It was
the
a
shark attack is
megalodon.
unlikely in general. But if
Oh.
that's true, then what really happened to Michelle Von Emster? Let's look at some alternate theories as to who or what could have killed Michelle. The first theory is that Michelle went for a midnight naked swim and subsequently drowned.
This doesn't really look like the area you would go to for a midnight swim. It's very rocky and kelpy. This is not ideal swimming conditions.
Proponents of this
Yeah.
theory believe Michelle could have gotten caught in a current or riptide and then knocked against the rocks where she died and was fed upon by blue sharks.
Rocks
A heavy
populi.
impact with rocks could explain the neck break. However, it seems unlikely that Michelle would go for a midnight swim due to the fact that, according to records, the water would have been too cold at 59 degrees, with the night air being 57 degrees. In fact, Michelle was last seen wearing a green trench coat at 8 p.m. So obviously, she was aware of the cold.
Did she have anything under the trench coat? That's a weird question. Never mind.
No, wait a second. You mean she was one of those like?
Well, I thought if
flasher
she was
guys?
going to jump into the ocean naked, then maybe she was walking around with a trench coat specifically because she was naked underneath,
Holy shit, you're right.
you know? But probably not. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
I mean, it kind of makes sense now you put it that way.
Oh, put it in the theory list.
The second theory is that Michelle died as the result of a fall from Sunset Cliffs. A medical examiner for San Francisco said that Michelle's neck, rib, and pelvic injuries were more consistent with injuries from falls or car accidents. Sunset Cliffs is known as one of the most beautiful sightseeing spots in San
Right
Diego,
on.
but is also known for having crumbling sandstone, and people have died in the past in this spot.
To be fair, it looks very dangerous. You break your neck on that.
But the injury she sustained.
Yeah, I don't think falling from this would cause your leg to fall off and
Yeah,
point.
that
I could definitely see how someone would fall off this. I mean, it's very crumbled. This is not a stable little ridge here. I say as I stand on top of it.
Some believe it was here that Michelle could have either intentionally jumped, accidentally fell, been hit by a car, or maybe Michelle was pushed off the edge. Which brings us to our third and final theory, that Michelle was murdered. Let's go over some details that fit that narrative. The neighborhood Michelle lived in at the time of her death had a reputation for drugs and was nicknamed the War Zone.
The
fact
War
that
Zone.
Michelle was found naked is also strange, since I find it hard to explain how a shark or accidental drowning victim would be naked. Though, in addition to a lifeguard once claiming to have seen Michelle swimming naked, a work acquaintance named Edwin Decker would reveal in an interview that Michelle had a hippie vibe and had told him
fuck?
that she, quote, liked to surf naked, end quote.
What
It
the
sounds like
fuck?
Like a Law and Order interview. Like they found the guy at the local grocery store moving boxes around. He's like, yeah, she had a hippie vibe to her. Yeah, I seen her out there by the rocks swimming naked.
Also-
what were you doing out there, sir?
Wait, this guy was a bartender too. So in fact, he's probably the same Law and Order. So he's cleaning glasses at the bar. Yeah, I seen her before. She used to come here every Thursday.
Yeah, that rings a bell or two. That shakes a tambourine.
Although, her friends never recalled her surfing, and local surfers don't recall ever seeing her surfing. Perhaps one of the most suspicious details is the fact that Michelle's purse was found about 2.5 miles away from her body, in the sand on the base of the seawall. The purse contained Michelle's keys, driver's license, makeup, pay stub, and a fanny pack containing $27 in cash. What's odd is the purse was discovered on a heavily used stretch of beach, meaning it's unlikely that her purse could sit there for 24 hours without any of the money or the purse itself being stolen. This has led some to believe that somebody hurt Michelle, left her to die in the ocean, and then planted the purse to make it look like an accident. Or maybe she was drowned. As mentioned before, Michelle would have had to take a big gulping breath to ingest the sand found in her lungs.
Damn.
Experts mentioned this only could have happened at the bottom of the ocean, but if someone were to have drowned her in the shallow water of the sandy shoreline, that could perhaps explain the sand. Either way, there are only two suspects, both unofficial. The first suspect is Edwin Decker, a friend who worked as a bartender next to Michelle's old job at Rumor's coffee shop. Decker, if you recall, was the one who claimed Michelle told him, quote, she liked to surf naked, end quote. A fact that would conveniently explain why she was found that way. Decker also claims the night before Michelle's death, he and her had drinks and had flirted for weeks beforehand. He also claims they kissed in his apartment after getting drinks, and that Michelle left his apartment at 5 a.m. in a cab. Though, Decker also mentions there was a friend sleeping nearby them in his apartment that night. Here's what Decker had to say about Michelle.
Decker.
There was a total intellectual connection. I thought there was an emotional connection too. At least on my part there was. And we also had a physical connection. I was so bummed when a couple of days went by and she hadn't called. I was about to give up on the idea, end quote. Later, when he found out that Michelle had died in a shark attack, he wrote and eventually published this poem. Quote,
Jesus Christ. Okay.
you know, wait till you hear the poem.
Oh,
Wait
and
till
he's
you-
accusing her of oh, she's a real hippie.
Quote, the report said there was a tattoo, a butterfly on her shoulder, which I remembered that night on my couch when I, like the shark, chewed on her lips
Joke.
and took off her shirt. End
What
quote.
the fuck? No. Shame on him.
It's not even a good poem, it's just weird.
No, it's very strange.
This sounds like something a drunk man would say as he's laying on the sidewalk just babbling.
I don't like that one bit.
And like the shark chewed on her lips and took off her shirt.
No, the shark was not doing that, sir. The shark is 10 times less creepier than you.
Creepiness aside, Decker actually teamed up with an investigator around 2008 and wrote to the San Diego Medical Examiner asking them to reevaluate Michelle's case, which obviously wouldn't be the first thing on the to-do list of a person who murdered the victim.
Gotta be honest, that's the first thing I'd do.
Really?
Yeah.
Because of the guilt? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, because they'd be like, well, couldn't possibly be him.
No, that's
Yeah.
I think
If I
that's
was like, you
that's,
better find this killer.
that's a movie plot thing. That's not.
Yeah. I bet it's happened.
The second suspect was an unknown stalker who had stalked Michelle at her previous job at Rumor's coffee shop. She reportedly left that job to work a different job at Cabrillo Stationery and Office Supply because she believed the unknown man wouldn't stalk her there. Michelle had mentioned that she didn't know this man's name, but that he rode a motorcycle. Denise Knox, Michelle's former boss at the office supply store, recalled a day at the store after Michelle's death when a man came in with a copy of Michelle's autopsy report to make additional copies. In 2014, Knox told the San Diego Reader, quote, the weird guy who wanted all those copies of her autopsy, he rode a motorcycle too, end quote. So after hearing the theories, what do you think happened? Was this actually a shark attack after all? Was this a case of accidental drowning? Did Michelle accidentally or intentionally fall to her death? Or was this case more sinister than it seems at surface level?
It was probably more sinister than it seems at surface level.
The tragic passing of Michelle Von Emster will remain unsolved.
Yeah, it's fucking weird.
I'm put.
Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. Settle in.
2
Find
hours.
a comfortable chair. If you're on a run, it's going to be a long one. Whatever you do while listening to this podcast, to drive, I don't know, there's probably going to be a multi-parter unless you're driving somewhere really, really far. Thank you to David who wrote it. It's called Dean Coral, Candyman, Pied Piper, Monster. It's an absolute beast of a script. So let's just jump into it, shall we? If you're new here, former of the show, I've never read this before. We're going to read it and explore and possibly have our days ruined together. Let's go. This is the story of the so-called Houston mass murders. And hold on to your hats, because it's going to get rough.
Houston mass murders is
On
actually
August 8th,
crazy.
1973, in a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of Houston, Texas. an unmarked police car pulled up to an L-shaped collection of galvanized steel sheds owned by Southwest Boat Storage. Detectives approached boat shed number 11, a storage unit that was 12 feet wide and 34 feet long. The detectives discovered that the shed doors were padlocked shut. One of the detectives walked down the road to the house of Mamie Mayner. Mayner. Sorry, Mamie. Brutalized your name. David's even provided me a pronunciation guide. It doesn't make it any easier. It's still hard. They were the owner of the storage complex, and the police asked for the key to number 11. Mayner explained that the renters of each shed supplied their own padlocks, and thus she didn't have the keys. The detective asked for permission to break the lock on shed number 11, and Mayner gave her consent. The detective returned to where his colleagues were waiting. They used a pair of bolt cutters to remove the padlock and pulled open the doors. Is that allowed? I feel like if you're renting something, it's you who gets to make the decision on whether someone can break into it, no? But I guess I'm wrong because...
Well, no, because hence in the term, you're renting it, so it's not yours, you're just borrowing it. So therefore, if police come in, your borrowing authority is, outweighed by the person who actually owns it, because you just, you technically only own it for a certain amount of time, and after that, the ownership is back on to the regular owner. And plus, let's say something were to happen to that shit, like somebody were to damage it or rob it, you're not gonna be like, oh yeah, I have to repay for this. You're gonna charge the actual owner. You're gonna be like, hey dude, what happened? This is supposed to be under your protection and shit, But yeah, you're like, no, I don't have to pay for it. So yeah. Fucking loud.
One of those things where it's like, yeah, we know that you're in court. It's like, yeah, we know you're guilty of sin. We know you did it. We found all of those bodies in the boat shed. And then the lawyer will be like, no, you didn't.
Objection.
Because of the lock. And the judge will be like, he goes free. Which I know this happens because of you don't want the police just busting into everything all the time, and there needs to be due process. But it does.
And they
suck
ruin
when it
shit, and
happens,
they
doesn't it?
push it out of, they make your room into a mess and don't put anything back.
They saw a stack of empty cardboard boxes, 2 acetylene torches attached to large fuel tanks, 2 10-pound sacks of lime. I know what sacks of lime are used for. This is for helping to decompose bodies, because this has come up on Casual Criminal several times. Sometimes used to speed up the decomposition of organic material. There we go. 8 empty 20-gallon cans that previously contained emergency drinking water, 2 empty plastic garbage containers, some cans of spray paint, a roll of soiled carpet, an unconnected telephone, some spare wires, batteries, and sundry tools. At the back of the shed was a half-stripped 1971 Chevrolet Camaro. Jesus Christ, how big was this? Oh, it was 34 feet long, 12 feet wide, so it's a good-sized storage unit.
Yeah,
it's like, all this junk.
Christ, you could live in there.
Which police later found out had been stolen. And on the right side of the shed was a child's yellow bicycle, which fortunately had a serial number on it, allowing the police to quickly confirm by radio that it was the one purchased by the Dramala family, whose 13-year-old son, James, had gone missing 5 days earlier on August the 3rd. A few feet away from the bicycle was a plastic bag containing a large collection of boys' clothing, a small and medium sizes, some intended for children, but with most of the garments intended for teenagers. Oh my god. Unlike those big tanks and the lie, are they people? Oh god, he's dissolving children in barrels. David, why do we have to do this? The detectives had brought with them a 17-year-old witness named Elmer Wayne Henley. He was the first to head into the shed. As Detective Carl Siebeneicher later recalled, quote, he started to take a step inside, but then his face just turned ashen, pale, grim. He kind of staggered around just outside the door like he was trying to get himself together, and right then, I just knew there was going to be something inside that shed. I was positive. Why did they send the kid in first? It's like, all right, mate, go on in there. It's like, they don't want to
they're go on.
Just like
go on, enough with you.
Checking it's safe, all right,
piss off, mate.
You find the bodies first.
Yeah, go on then, bro.
Arrived containing 2 more detectives and 2 prison inmates who, under the Texas trustee system, could basically be utilized by law enforcement as slave labor. Wait, when was this? When was this happening? 1973? You can't use prisoners as slave labor anymore, right? Although I do hear, aren't they stamping license plates and stuff for cents an hour? It's like, how do I utilize this? Why aren't I using prisoners for labor, especially for true crime? So you guys want to write about your crimes? It's not a bad idea for a channel. Prisoners who've been found guilty and admitted to their crimes. Write about their crimes. It's a great YouTube channel. The inmates were put to work digging into the dirt floor of the shed. After 15 minutes, the prisoners had dug 6 inches into the ground and come upon a layer of white lime powder. A bad omen. A few minutes later, the stench of rotting flesh pervaded the shed. Shortly thereafter, they uncovered a boy's skull. At this point, one of the inmates was overcome by nausea and bolted for the exit. None of the detectives attempted to detain him. Detective Larry Earls took up the fallen shovel and continued digging with the other inmates. The boy's torso, wrapped in a plastic sheet, was discovered. After a few minutes, the nauseated inmate returned with another shovel, apologized, and the 3 men continued to dig. The body had lain there for only a few days, and putrefaction had only recently set in. The boy was blonde in his early teens, with a cloth rag shoved in his mouth to gag him, held in place by masking tape which had been wrapped around his head. There was also a cord wound tightly around his neck. The detectives immediately concluded that he had been strangled to death. This was the body of 13-year-old James Dramala, who had last been seen riding his yellow bike in the suburb of Pasadena. The 3 men continued digging. A few inches deeper, they discovered another body, this time the fully decomposed skeleton of another victim. By now it was getting dark, so some spotlights were brought into the shed in order for the excavation to continue. One of the detectives ran to the patrol car and drove to a nearby jail to pick up even more inmates. They were going to need to dig up every inch of the shed. It was going to be a long night. Meanwhile,
some Batman shit.
began to dig directly to the right of where the first 2 bodies had been discovered. 8 inches down, they found another layer of lime, and 2 more bodies lying side by side. Both of them teenagers, both of them gagged. Jesus Christ, this body count is already getting up there. They've just started. One of them had been shot in the head, the other had been strangled with a pull string from a set of Venetian blinds. The latter's mouth was opened so wide that his lips had broken free of the tape adhesive, and his teeth were visible above and below the binding, signaling to detectives present that he had died not only struggling for air, but suffering from some other form of torture as he was strangled. The fixed, agonized expression indicated that, if he had been able to breathe, he would have been screaming. At 10 p.m., a now enlarged extraction team of multiple inmates and detectives, each with handkerchiefs tied over their faces to ward off the smell of rot, discovered a mass grave in the back, right-hand corner of the shed. 4 more bodies, this time all in an advanced state of decomposition, were uncovered. 2 had been buried in the fetal position, 1 was lying flat on his back, and 1 had been buried in an upright sitting position. By 11:55 p.m., each of the bodies had been removed from the hole, and the operation was suspended for the night, with 8 bodies in total being found. 3 of the 8 victims, who were the least decomposed, showed signs of their pubic hairs being forcibly ripped out and bite marks on their genitals, but all victims unearthed that night showed signs of intense torture prior to death. They had various large objects shoved inside their rectums, and a few of them had glass rods inserted into their penises before the rods were smashed by blunt force. Dude, we're 2 pages in. I'm not. This is grim. Excavations continued the next day. At 12:05 p.m., 2 skeletons wrapped in plastic were disinterred. The hours dragged on, with the heat of the steel shed in the summer and the smell of thoroughly cooked, putrefied liquid that had soaked into the soil, making it necessary for the excavation team to take frequent breaks for fresh air. One of the detectives kicked in the back wall of the shed until the metal bent upward, creating a hole through which more air could flow. But it made little difference. One by one, detectives and convicts exited the boat shed, often to vomit, and then lay down on the ground of the storage facility's small parking lot for several minutes in order to recover. The hot Texas sun was preferable to the stench of death inside. Every fall of the shovel increased its potency. By mid-afternoon, 2 more bodies were unearthed. One had been castrated, with the genitals wrapped in the same plastic sheet in which the body was found. The other had his penis chewed in half. In the late afternoon, in the back corner of the shed, a 1971 Chevy having long since been removed, 2 more bodies were uncovered. They bore identification cards with the names Donald and Jerry Waldrop, 15 and 13, respectively. They had lain in the ground for 2.5 years. Jesus, so this has been going on for a long time. 2 more victims were unearthed near the entrance of the shed. One of them was dressed in an American flag swimsuit, a t-shirt with the peace sign on it, and black leather cowboy boots. He'd been shot in the head. The 9th and final body for that day was uncovered at 8:30 p.m. in an advanced state of decomposition, showing similar signs of torture to all the other victims. There were 2 main causes of death. Some of the victims had been strangled with ligatures, some had been shot in the head. However, one of the victims had a caved-in ribcage, indicating that he'd been kicked or bludgeoned to death. In total, 17 bodies were found buried in the soft soil of the boat shed, but witness Elmer Wayne Henley claimed that there were other burial sites scattered around the area where many more bodies could be found. Wait, is this guy's got to be... is he going to rank up there for like worst serial killers? Because this is a 17 bodies in one location and many more to be found.
Dude, what? That's
How
what
have I
you're
never
worried
heard of
about,
this guy?
dude? Like, yeah, like, bro, what the fuck? Like, this guy's actually insane. Like, mangling dicks, dude. Biting half the dicks off. Ripping the... Oh, my God, dude. Oh, man, dude. I don't even know if I want to go through with this right now, dude. Like, holy shit. This is too much, dude. This might have to be where I draw the line, man. Like, this dude, what the fuck? We are 10 minutes in, and this is like, bro, what? This guy bit the groin and bit, like, you know, the fucking groin. Oh my God, dude, what the fuck? Dude, that's
Meet
so
Dean
weird.
Corll. Dean Arnold Corll was born
Like,
to
bro,
newlyweds
shove the
Mary
fucking...
Emma Corll,
Oh,
maiden
man.
name Robinson, and Arnold Edwin Corll on December the 24th, 1939. Dean Corll's father was a 23-year-old factory worker in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and his mother was a housewife of the same age. Dean's father was able to avoid being drafted when the United States entered World War II at the end of 1941. As an essential factory worker, he was further down the list than many of his peers. Then in 1942, Arnold and Mary Corll had a second son named Stanley. This is where, in most Casual Criminalist episodes, I'll tell you that the father was a physically abusive drunk. But he was not. The most that could be said against Arnold Corll was that he was unnecessarily dour, joyless, and strict. For example, Dean and Stanley always asked their mother for permission to go out and play because they knew their father would always say no. For another example, when Dean was a toddler, he put his foot in the toilet and then decided to clean himself off by climbing in the sink. No damage, no mess was made, except for a little bit of water splashed on the floor. But Arnold was angry at the aberrant behaviour and punished Dean by having him quietly sit in a chair for a couple of hours. For a kid, that's forever. Unusually for the time, Arnold Corll did not use corporal punishments at all. Meanwhile, Dean's mother Mary was extremely indulgent and protective of her children, as she delighted in their adorable mishaps. This difference of perspective and temperament was one of the causes of friction in Mary and Arnold's marriage. They divorced in 1946 when Dean was 6 years old. So far, so normal. As David said, normally it'd be like, oh yeah, no, this is the making of a monster. But it seems, for rather unusually, he had a pleasant enough upbringing. Shortly thereafter, the draft caught up with Arnold Corll. At the age of 30, he entered the United States Air Force, having dodged the Second World War completely. He was shipped out to Memphis, Tennessee. Wait, why would they have 1946? Why are you still drafting people? There's the Korean War in the early 50s, right? Or late 40s, early 50s, something like that. But did they need draft for that? Huh, I thought that was just like a big wartime, like Vietnam, Second World War, that kind of thing. This dramatic turn of events sparked a brief reconciliation of Mary and Arnold's relationship. They sold the family home in Indiana, and Mary drove a truck towing a motorhome down to Tennessee to live near the Air Force Base where Arnold was stationed. However, Mary and Arnold's relationship was not stable, and they were on again, off again for a number of years. Meanwhile, Mary found a job and put Dean into school and Stanley into daycare, later opting to have an elderly farming couple look after Stanley while she was at work instead. Mary claims
I bet you it's
this
the
time was
elderly
a
farming
happy time
couple,
for
huh?
the boys. However, at the exact same time, a 6-year-old Dean became withdrawn, isolated, and uninterested in playing with other kids. The most likely cause would be distress at the divorce. More darkly, it can be an early sign of psychopathy. But the latter doesn't completely fit. Dean was capable of socializing when he had to, and of displaying empathy for others. Dean always worried about his younger brother. See, the empathy for others, displaying empathy for others, and capable of socializing, psychopaths can totally do that, because they're calculating. And they're like, oh, this is the face that I have to show now. Oh. Or like, you know, that kind of shit. But like, worrying about his younger brother, that speaks not to psychopathy. When Stanley didn't return home from a friend's house on time, Dean would anxiously call Mary at work. He expressed similar concern for Mary herself and would warn her when she was driving too fast. He was just unusually disinterested in making any friendships whatsoever. And some kids are just more introverted like that. It's not necessarily indicative of any major disorder or past trauma. And Dean did not show any other troubling signs like harming animals. Perhaps the divorce affected Dean, or perhaps his father's non-violent strictness had made him more timid, but there was no known childhood trauma more severe than that, nor any behaviours of Dean's that were major red flags at the time. I've said before, like, even if you're horribly abused as a kid, it doesn't excuse you becoming a serial killer. And it's like, oh, why were you a serial killer? My dad was a bit strict. It's not okay. Yet, given what Dean Coral would grow up to be, we cannot be too quick to accept the idea that his childhood was relatively normal and happy, or that he wasn't born with some kind of undiagnosed mental illness. It is always possible some red flags stemming from either nature or nurture existed and neither of his parents noticed them. Young psychopaths can be secretive. Perhaps he was torturing small animals and never got caught. Or perhaps Dean was physically or sexually abused by a teacher or a neighbor and never told anyone. See, this is like when someone is this up as an adult, I don't know, I've made so many episodes where it's like, yeah, he was. He probably was. Or is it possible that Mary Coral knew something that she wasn't telling and went out of her way to...
I'm saying it's either he would torture animals and not get caught, you know? Like he just was really good at hiding it and just never got caught. Or he probably got fucking R-worded, you know? Or, you know, like touched or abused by somebody. It has to be, dude. There's no way. There's no way you're mangling half of somebody's penis off, and they're all boys too. And you know, there's no way you're ripping somebody's pubes off and biting their groin. Like, what the fuck? And that's normal. Like,
rose-colored tint to the story of Dean's upbringing when talking to the police.
Like you're not shoving glass rods up people's penises and then breaking the rods, dude. Like, what the fuck? Or
which has impeded analysis by forensic psychologists ever since. I mean, maybe, but we'll never know. Bottom line, if something happened in Dean's childhood to fuck him up, we'll never know what it was. Exactly. What we do know is that Dean's shyness and lack of socialization was exacerbated by physical illness. Just a year later, at the age of 7, Dean developed periodic outbreaks of fever and joint pain that went undiagnosed for 3 years. This restricted his ability to participate in physical activities and made him even less likely to play with other kids and form friendships. I know it's a terrible thought, but I'm thinking, yeah, if I was a kid and they're like, oh, you've got the fevers occasionally, it's like, oh no, so I can't go outside in the freezing cold and kick around a ball for 2 hours? Oh no, I have to stay in the warm? Oh, I hated sports. We also knew that Dean's parents never bothered to give him a sexual education. We know this because in the summer of 1949, when Dean was 9 years old, some neighborhood kids shot out a streetlight. Wait, isn't it the schools, like, this was something we were taught at school. Like, they'd separate the boys and the girls, and then they'd teach us about that stuff. That's like part of the curriculum. Dean and Stanley witnessed the vandalism and told the local sheriff about it. As a reward, he gave them 2 tin deputy badges. This had nothing directly to do with sex, but do bear with me. Yes, I was wondering how this connected. When the boys proudly showed their mother, she flew into a rage and gave the sheriff a piece of her mind about making her 2 boys into snitches, saying they'd get beaten up. To avoid this, she sent Dean and Stanley to spend the rest of the summer in Indiana on her parents' farm. When Dean returned to Tennessee, Mary Coral just assumed that 9-year-old Dean now knew everything there was to know about sex because he'd presumably seen a bunch of barnyard animals fucking, and to quote, "What kind of sex training do you give a boy that's lived on a farm? You don't have to tell him nothing." Okay. Also, it's weird
what
that
the
you refer to it as
fuck?
sex training.
Training, yeah, what the fuck?
Now drop and give me 1 push-up.
Wouldn't that have the reverse effect? Like, are they gonna
Maybe
be
they just
attracted to
didn't have
animals
sex
fucking?
education at
That's
school
fucking
in
disgusting, dude.
Given that Dean Coral turned out to be a closeted homosexual living in the American
Dude,
South in the
this
mid-20s,
is a very... Oh man, I probably should have put a warning, like, to not eat anything while you're fucking watching this shit, or... Fucking... God.
century, and given that his later crimes involved sexual assault, sadism, ephebophilia... okay. Need to look that up. Look up. An adult who is sexually attracted to adolescents. Oh god. Wait, isn't that just the P word?
Yeah,
Oh
pedophilia.
yes, and another word starting with P and ending in ophelia. Yes, we have to do this because otherwise YouTube will never... I mean, YouTube's probably not going to let me get paid for this video. If you want to leave a super thanks, that would be amazing. Help support the show. Don't feel pressure. It's okay if you don't. But yeah, I'm just doing my best to keep us monetized, even though it's highly unlikely. It is possible that this atmosphere of parental negligence and country bumpkin sexual repression did him no favours. Also, it's a bit absurd to expect a 9-year-old who hasn't even felt such impulses yet to have suddenly learned everything there is to know about sex by simply spending a summer watching cattle, poultry or horses occasionally have sex on a farm. You see, sex is complicated, especially the tumultuous passions of adult human relationships, cultural attitudes towards homosexuality, thorny issues around consent, and, not torturing people for your own monetary sexual gratification. The farmyard, as sex ed, is like saying a 9-year-old could become an expert at painting landscapes by spending a summer at the zoo, watching chimpanzees hurl their own shit at the wall, though it may make the kid an expert on the painting techniques of Jackson Pollock. Oh, David reminds me here, this is an ideal place to plug his book. Okay, David, you've got it. David Baker's latest book, Sex, 2 Billion Years of Procreation and Recreation, with a foreword by guess who? That's right, me. This book's fantastic. I read it.
Hold on. Dude, what you just said right there? Dude, that's like fucking trying to tell me that you know how to fly a plane just because you played a fucking Microsoft Flight Simulator. Like, what?
I think David says here...
That is not how that works,
The Australian version came out on the 5th of October. That was ages ago. The American and UK versions will be coming out under the shortest history of sex, which is a different name. I have the Aussie version. Just in time for Valentine's Day. It comes out on the 7th of February. So hopefully we'll get this edited and live before the 7th of February. Pick up this book from wherever you get your books. It's forever. Anyway, it's more likely that Mary Coral simply didn't wish to broach the subject of sex with her son, and the farm provided a convenient, half-assed excuse not to do it. I didn't learn about sex from my parents. I learned about it at school. And then when I was confused about something, I just look it up on the internet. Easy.
I actually didn't really learn anything from anybody. Kind of just knew.
Of attention and quality of the parenting that Dean was probably getting from his mother, no matter how rosily Mary Coral might describe his childhood subsequently. If there's something seriously wrong with Dean as a child, there's no guarantee that his parents would have noticed it. I mean, just because she didn't want to teach him about sex doesn't mean that she's negligent. In 1950, when we'll do the sex training, weird.
From now on, I want you to do 1 push-up a day.
1 cock push-up.
In 1950, when Dean was 10, doctors figured out that a heart murmur was causing him to have periodic rheumatic fevers. He was put on medication and advised to avoid physically strenuous activities. He was banned from taking part in gym classes and spent quite a lot of time out of school. They'd be like, Simon, we've got some bad news. You can no longer participate in, well, we call it PE, physical education in the UK. I'd be like, oh no! Do you guys, like mostly Americans, because it's a big American audience, do you guys do something called the bleep test? Does Britain, do other people in the UK do the bleep test? It's this tape, and it tortures you. It's like, there's 2 lines set up in the gymnasium, and you have to run from one to the other. And this machine goes like, stage 1, boop, and then you have to get to the other side, and then it's like, boop, and then you go back, boop, and it gradually gets faster and faster until you die. I mean, not until you die, but it is miserable. And they used to use it to rank us in how good we were. I was not very good, but I also didn't care.
I always completed
Mary
those
and Arnold
every
remarried
time.
and moved the family to Pasadena, a suburb in the metropolitan area of the rapidly growing city of Houston, Texas, where Arnold supported the family and Mary stayed at home. Their second marriage lasted until 1953, when they once again got divorced. We do not know how the tension in their second marriage manifested, or whether a now adolescent Dean witnessed any fierce arguments. Again, Mary's account of Dean's upbringing is suspiciously uber positive and glossed over, but who knows, maybe it was as faultless as she says. According to Mary, the divorce was amicable. Arnold remained on good terms with her. He continued to be present in his children's lives, and he diligently paid child support. Mary seems to have barely had a negative word to say against Arnold. To quote, "Some people just don't click. It don't mean they ain't decent people." Not long after the divorce, Mary swiftly got betrothed to a large, handsome travelling salesman named Jake West. Suffice to say, it has never been fully clarified how or when they met. But Mary was a housewife in 1953, and Jake was a travelling salesman. Do the maths. Oh God, what am I missing? Oh, okay, so he's like a travelling salesman. He's like, hello there. Can I interest you in a vacuum cleaner and my penis? Sorry, that was crass. Again, forgive the speculation, because we've been deprived of reliable information about Coral's childhood, but if the bubbly and flighty Mary was habitually unfaithful to the dour and joyless Arnold, this might explain the on-again, off-again nature of their 14-year relationship without there being something Arnold did that Mary would speak of about resentfully in later years. And adultery might indicate an instability in Dean's home life that Mary might be reticent to mention. It It also might explain the grounds for 2 divorces in an era before no fault, where you needed to show abuse, adultery, or abandonment in order to obtain one. Man, the past was the worst. It's like, no, we just don't like each other that much anymore. It's like we just grew apart. Nope. One of you has to adulter. Get on with it. But even then,
Yes,
an adulterous
adulter.
parent is a weak causal link to becoming a sexual sadist and a serial killer. Yes, and most importantly, not even anywhere near an excuse. He had a great childhood compared to some other people. And they're, like Pedro Lopez was horribly abused as a child. Does that make Pedro Lopez any less of a piece of shit? No. That's it. No, it doesn't. But it does make him, like, have a tiny fraction of not an excuse, but like a path towards it. Like, yes, that nudged him towards there. Whereas Dean just seems like, I guess he's just going to be like a natural psychopath.
Can you take it
whatever.
first?
Just a natural fucking weirdo.
Okay, I
Jake West
didn't
sold
see it.
clocks on a route that took him through East Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. As such, Mary and Jake moved with Dean and Stanley to the small town of Vida in Texas, a stone's throw from the Louisiana border. Vida was a backwater full of moonshiners and tax evaders, with a population of just 9,000 and a frequent site of rallies by the KKK.
Of course.
Just lawless down there. They're just like, that's the place where the FBI, they don't even go
You
to.
fellas are dead,
What's going on
Capri.
in Vida? At the time, no black people dared live in the town. Jake went out on the road and earned a decent living so that Mary could be a homemaker. In 1955, Mary and Jake had a daughter named Joyce. As a teenager, Dean Cole got middling grades at school and enthusiastically played trombone in the school band. He also took up skinny dipping with other boys in a quarry pond called the Blue Hole. While we have no information on his sexual awakening, it's more than likely by this time Dean realized his same-sex attraction. Correspondingly, we have no
Nice,
information
good
on
test.
whether the realization caused him any emotional distress, but living in backwoods East Texas in the 1950s, we can also safely assume that it caused some. None of Dean's schoolmates remember him ever having a girlfriend and forget about them noticing him with boys. Meanwhile, the physical exertion and likely physical excitement of skinny dipping at the Blue Hole wreaked havoc on Dean's heart condition, and after a fainting spell, his doctor told him to give up the activity altogether. Therefore, Dean returned to his solitary ways. Can't they give him drugs for this? It's just a heart murmur. Can't they, like, give him... Did beta blockers or whatever exist back in the day? Is that what beta blockers do? They keep your heart, like, chill, right? So it's always just... bah, bah, bah. And then you're like, I'm really stressed out, and your heart's like, bah, bah. A friend of mine from back in the day was on beta blockers because he had, like, some heart thing. And you just got to take them for the rest of your life.
Damn.
Let's go, you guys. Push in there. We got 12 minutes.
Near the town
We're
of
gonna
Vida,
burn
wild
half time.
pecans. David gave me a pronunciation guide for pecans. I know it's pecans in American, David, but I'm going to say it my
fucking-
way. Pecans. Grew in abundance along
Pecans,
the Trinity River.
pecans. I like
Mary
pecans
got
better.
The idea that the family could harvest them and make candy that Jake could sell on his sales route. The family piled into the car and drove all the way to Houston, Texas, where they visited a candy factory and paid a fee of $50 or $575 in modern money for the recipe for pralines. Again, David, I know how to pronounce pralines. It's not even different in America. Pralines, it's a common word, isn't it? Next, David will be like, car. It's like, thanks, David. A confectionery involving pecans, brown sugar, and cream that has a similar consistency to fudge. Why love praline? Is this such an unusual thing? Praline's delicious. The whole cottage industry operated out of the kitchen and garage. Dean was conscripted to keep the machines that cleaned the pecans running, while Mary did the work of making the actual confectionery in the kitchen. Now I'm pronouncing pecans like an American, I can't stop. Then Dean was in charge of wrapping them. Stanley helped out where he could, but as a young man with a decent social life, he had little interest. Dean would handle the deliveries in Vidor and would pocket the money for himself. His stepfather, Jake, would take the bulk of the pralines with him on his route through East Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi for sale. Soon, the family was no longer harvesting wild pecans, but was purchasing bucket loads of them wholesale from local distributors. The production line soon increased to include Divinities, a pecan and nougat-based confectionery. Nougat is one where it's like, it is
Nougat.
nougat, right? It's not nuggets. It's nougat. but it's got a weird
Nugget,
spelling.
nougat,
N-O-U-G-A-T.
nougat.
Based
You mean
confectionery and
nougat?
chocolate-covered
Recommended that
pecans.
beer
By all
sounds good.
accounts, Dean, not having much of a social life, enjoyed the work.
You mean
The confectionery
nougat?
business
We
made a
should
lot
have
of money,
another one
so much
here,
so that in
Diego
1958, when Dean was 18 years old, the family moved to the city of Houston and sold their products under
There's
the
a tiger
trademark
on
Pecan
that
Prince.
DH mark,
Dean
that dog
finished up
squad
his high
tank
school
mark.
degree via correspondence and became a full-time and largely unpaid worker for his mother and stepfather. It was at this point that
Taco,
Dean
good
began
news,
to
happy
clash
tank,
with Jake,
as
having
well,
several
mascot.
heated arguments to the point that Jake refused to speak to him. Ostensibly, this was over the business, but there may have been
None of that
deeper
guy
issues
solo and
involved.
heavies.
In the following year, 1959, the family bought a
Good news,
shop
happy
at a
tank,
small
as well,
factory
mascot.
for
I
Pecan
told them.
Prince.
Solo in the
Houston
heavy,
Heights, a
man.
growing industrial
Take on us,
neighborhood where they
take
could
on
step
us,
up
Bill.
production of their
Now we gotta
increasingly
go over
popular
smoking.
brands. This is a very nice, like, entrepreneurial story. They buy a recipe for, like, praline.
Tank ping,
Like,
tank
nowadays
ping.
you
We
just
need
like
assistance.
you just go on Google and find a really popular one.
Baker,
And
can you
now
shuffle
they're
your
like they're
on the
scaling this
point?
business
Ah,
like this.
fucking knew I should have taken the
Meanwhile,
shot
Mary's
first.
father
Baker.
died, and she sent 19-year-old Dean to Indiana to live on the farm with his grandmother. Mary thought it would be good for her mother to have a man floating about the place, and she thought it would be good for Dean to get out in the world and away from Jake. Up in Indiana, Dean got a job working at a coil factory. He purchased a telescope and briefly took up amateur astronomy before getting bored and giving up. He also bought himself a camera and took up
Amateur.
photography, which he stuck to, and
He's
later
an
a movie camera,
amateur.
which he used to film the kids on neighboring farms. Like a weirdo. Arguably a red flag given his later history. Oh, yes. He's like, come over here, child. Let me film you. Oh, Dean, you weirdo. It reminds me of I was trying to do the voice of the P word. Or like
Can you
allegedly
drop
from
a
Family Guy.
strike
He's
or
always
bombing
like,
on
is he into
Able Monarch
Chris?
here in those trenches?
Dark.
The F5.
Dean didn't get along very well with his grandmother, who said he would constantly be slacking off
F5?
and wouldn't help her out with many chores. While
Yeah.
Dean was up in Indiana,
There's a
he
bunch
met
of
a
them
girl
coming
named
out of
Wanda,
there.
who grew infatuated with him. Mary asked Dean to return to Houston in 1962 to help out with the flourishing candy
That
business,
doesn't matter
this
for
time
now.
offering to pay him a salary. He maintained a correspondence
Tank
with
behind
Wanda,
us, tank
sending her
behind us.
candy with his letters. Then Wanda phoned Dean at the Pecan Prince factory and said,
Tank on ping,
Dean,
yeah, back up-
are you sitting
back to our
down?
shit.
Dean replies that he wasn't. Okay, well, go ahead and sit down. What is it? It's like when you say "Are you sitting down?" It's not a real. It's how you say instead of saying like "I've got some news." It's not good news. It's basically the same thing. It doesn't actually mean you need to sit down, unless I mean he's got a heart condition, doesn't he? So maybe he does need to sit down. Dean, I'm getting married. Wanda said. Who to? Dean asked. To you. Wanda giggled, which is probably the cutest marriage proposal from a woman that I've ever heard, but Dean didn't see it that way. No, Dean lives somewhere else. Dean is gay. He hung up, never called Wanda again, and stopped sending her letters. And fair enough, Dean was gay, and Wanda didn't know. But this was a particularly brutal way of dealing with things. Yeah, that's mean, but also Wanda's definitely got the wrong end of the stick, because I don't think there doesn't seem to be any evidence that Dean
Yeah,
was
bitches
gay.
be
She's
liking
sending
gay
letters
motherfuckers.
Hey, I almost
defending
scored.
Dean.
Watch out, the
Buries
H
children in his storage locker. What the fuck? While living in Houston Heights, Dean Corll quickly gained the nickname the Candyman because of his reputation for giving out free candy to the local children, particularly when Dean passed by the local schools. And I'm sure very loud alarm bells started ringing in your heads. Yeah, but also no, because he's literally, that's his job. His family own like a chocolate business. It would kind of be weird if they didn't give out free chocolate to the local schools. It's just like a good like
Alright,
social,
so I think
what do they call it?
we
Like corporate
just-
social responsibility, that
we
kind of
need
shit.
to
Like
insert
when
you
companies do
guys in
stuff for
this
free, so
point.
people like them. But such was not the case in
We are in
1962
up close.
Houston, Texas, which was still a couple of decades away from the era of stranger danger. Yeah, I mean, and it's also like, it'd be way more suspect if Dean was going to the store and buying chocolate and then taking it to children at school. But if
Yeah,
he's
what the
literally
fuck?
known as the chocolate maker,
The chocolate
I don't
maker.
think it's that suspicious. Instead, Dean was simply viewed as a nice, quiet man who liked kids and
enemy
worked at a
supplies,
candy factory.
coming
out.
A Willy Wonka
Like
figure, if you
marker.
will. I was going to say, it's a bit like Willy Wonka. Like, no one thinks Willy Wonka's weird if he just came up. I mean, he's a fictional character, and everyone thinks Willy Wonka's weird, so I don't know what my argument here. But no one thinks Willy Wonka's a P word. It'd be a really different movie. The only person who became suspicious of Dean Corll's behaviour was his stepfather, Jake West. He observed how Dean behaved around children and teenage boys and told Mary that he thought Dean might be gay. Mary, with the characteristic homophobia of the time, rejected the suggestion, insisting that he was, quote, a loyal, obedient, loving, and good normal boy.
Staying settle point. Please took
Dude,
my-
anytime somebody says that they fucking love kids, I'm always suspicious of them.
Definitely not gay.
Because you don't have to like kids to just, you know that you gotta do the right thing, dude.
quote,
Like, what the
"It already
fuck?
seems
You
so
just
many
sound
broken
weird.
marriages."
Like, what are you going on about, bro?
Jake West was going down the toilet.
Accurate
In
enemy gears.
1962, Jake announced he would be taking over the business and would run Pecan Prints on his own, allowing Mary to return to her role as a housewife. Mary obeyed and ceded the business to Jake. But obviously, she resented this. To quote, he thought that Pecan Prince was already on
one's
its
past
feet,
that,
so he'd
Tiger.
get all the credit.
I fucking hate kids, but if I saw a fucking child in danger or some shit or about to die, obviously I'd fucking wouldn't. I'm not letting a kid die in front of me, dude. That would give me nightmares.
Mary, that's savage. It's like,
Like, that's what I'm saying, dude. Like, oh man. You know, like if I saw a kid about to get hit by a car or some shit, you know, obviously I'd like judo kick him out of the way. Even if I'm the one that gets hit by the car. Because I refuse to see a kid die in front of me, dude. That would give me fucking nightmares. But I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh yeah, dude, I fucking love kids. Because I fucking don't, dude. I hate kids. But, you know, still understand it. Like, you know, fucking innocence and shit.
Yeah, you want to kick me out of my business? I'm going to start my own business and compete with you. And it's like, you know, we're financially very entangled together as husband and wife. And she's like, I will crush you.
I must break you.
She appointed Dean as vice president and Stanley as secretary-treasurer in absentia, since the latter, now 20 years old, didn't want to work at the company full-time. I feel like he's like in absentia. It's like, so do you have a treasurer? It's like, no. Wait, why is a treasurer? Do you have treasurers at companies? Don't you have like CFOs or whatever? Or like bookkeepers, accountants, that kind of stuff? Mary had a talent for this kind of work, and it wasn't long before the Coral Candy Company started to make money. As strange as it may seem, there were now two competing candy companies operating under the same roof. Jake's reaction was to write letters to retailers across the American South, warning them that, quote unquote, someone was stealing his recipes and packaging candy just like Pecan Princes for sale. When Mary found out that Jake was doing this, it pretty much torpedoed the marriage. They got divorced in 1963. Yo, Mary, when you start competing in the same business as your husband without agreement on it, I don't want to say his blessing, she doesn't need to get his blessing, but it would be a bit weird, wouldn't it? That would be a bit weird. It'd be like if my wife started making educational videos just like mine and started taking my topics. I'd be like, what's going on?
Yeah, what's going on, mate?
That year, the Coral Company hired additional staff, purchased a warehouse, and converted it into a factory with a small candy shop out front. Dean moved into a makeshift apartment on the second floor. He also purchased a small Honda motorcycle on which he used to take the local kids on little joyrides. Ding, 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 those are love bells. That's got nothing to do with candy. He's like, hold on tight, children. Sounds good. Oh! A white Dodge delivery van with furniture and a portable television in the windowless back section of the vehicle. Bro, you just bought a P-word van, didn't you? The file letter cliches continue to roll in thick and fast. But of course, they weren't yet cliches back then. While we have very limited information on this period, it is highly likely that the 23-year-old Dean Coral had already begun his career as a predator. Before 1963 was out, a teenage male employee at the candy factory complained to his peers that Dean Coral had offered him money in exchange for sexual favors. Mary noted that Dean had started avoiding the youth, and once she found out the reason, she accused the teenager of propositioning Dean, not the other way around. It doesn't matter, Mary. Use your big brain. He's a 23-year-old, and the other one's a teenager. It doesn't matter if the teenager wants it. Dean can't. You can't. No. No. Mary promptly fired the teenage worker. Oh, Mary. Toby in HR is going to be really upset about that. The extent of Dean's predations on children and teenagers at the time is not known, nor is it clear whether he'd already started torturing and killing.
She probably did, because that stupid bitch.
Nor is it far behind. Like his father before him, the United States draft caught up with Dean Coral in 1964. I had no idea that the draft was such a big thing. Huh. I mean, like, I'm not against, like, national service, or, like, it's not conscription, what's it called? You know, when you go into the military, you have to go to the military for a couple of years. I kind of think, in some ways, that's good for a country, and good for people, but I wouldn't want to be drafted and actually have to go and fight, an actual war.
Same answer.
Because it's like, I'd like the discipline and to learn things about the military, but I don't want to go and get shot in, like, a trench, or in Vietnam. That just sounds horrible. On August the 10th, Coral reported to Fort Polk in Louisiana for basic training. Thereupon, he was transferred to Fort Benning in Georgia for specialized training in field radio repair. He was then posted to Fort Hood in Texas. Several years later, Coral himself claimed to acquaintances He'd had his
Stating
first sexual
setup so cool.
experiences with men while in the army, although he never went into detail. According to some accounts, Coral also claimed that he first realized he was gay in the army at the relatively advanced age of 24 or 25, but the veracity of this latter claim seems doubtful. Meanwhile, Dean's family had never been big fans of conscription or fighting in the armed forces, and so Mary approached the Red Cross and the Texas governor to secure a hardship discharge for him, claiming that Dean was needed at the candy company. Doesn't Dean have a super weak heart where he can't even do physical exercise? Surely that's something that gets you out of the draft. Mary was successful, and Dean was honorably discharged on June 11, 1965 with a clean record. Mary probably spared her son a trip to Vietnam, which is unfortunate because we know how this story goes. We know where it's going. It would have been better if Dean Coral had been killed in Vietnam. Dean Coral returned to Houston and moved into a small motorhome that was next to the new Coral Candy Company factory on 22nd Street and across the road from Helms Elementary School. Oh no. Oh no. He's living no.
Oh no.
Again, you might be hearing alarm bells. Oh, David, I absolutely am. It was not far from Jake West's factory. 2 or 3 times a day, Coral would drive over to the Pecan Prince factory and spy on comings and goings there. Both brands were popular, and things had gotten a little cutthroat between the 2 former spouses. To quote one Coral Candy employee, Mary hated Jake West and was deliberately trying to put him out of business. And so was Dean. Mary was always telling Dean how much she hated West and all this stuff. The atmosphere was very intense.
The atmosphere was intense.
Compared to what we know is coming, this sounds kind of like, I like these kind of business stories. This is like a good business story, and it's going to turn into a terrible murder story. It wasn't long before Jake West was new
terrible
slogan
murder.
Texas of Pecan Prince to quote the original Texas Pecan Chewy with obvious subtext. In retaliation, Mary inscribed on her boxes Coral Candy, new, improved, but with a woman's touch. Meanwhile, Dean took over the majority of day-to-day operations at the company, while Mary spent more of her free time shopping, going to beauty salons, visiting psychics and palm readers, okie dokie, and above all, going on copious numbers of dates. Mary was 49 years old in 1965, and by all accounts was still a handsome woman. She had a lot of fun with local bachelors in Houston, but being conscious of Jake West's own amorous conquests, she was determined to get remarried. Dean would get frustrated and disgusted when she tried to tell him about her dates. Mary, don't be telling your son. It's like, oh, I had a great date last night. It's like, Mum, don't want to know. Do not want to know, thank you. Dean Coral began to experiment with confectionery recipes and, like Willy Wonka, kept the precise ingredients and preparation methods a secret and individual workers in separate parts of the production process. According to one employee, this resulted in the quality of the Coral candies being far superior to Pecan Prince. In fact, Coral Candy nearly put Pecan Prince out of business. Coral also installed microphones in the factory and tapped the phone lines, allegedly in order to prevent industrial sabotage. Indeed, he once caught 2 employees on tape conspiring to steal some candy and sell it on the side, though he never rumbled any plot led by Jake West. Meanwhile, the Coral production line expanded to include candy apples, chocolate-covered fruits, and various assorted sweets. Dean also dived into factory work, getting into shape and becoming quite lean and muscular at 5'11" and 185 pounds. Siri, what's 185 pounds in kilograms? 83 kilos, big boy. Coral worked tirelessly without much of a social life, but he became extremely outgoing with employees on the factory floor and with clients, distributors, and business partners. This is that Psycho vibe, right? Because he doesn't really have any friends, but he's also very charming.
Oh, BRB chat. Give me a second. Whoops.
can turn it on when he wants to. He became known for his sense of humour and fondness for pranks. He also threw blowout Christmas parties where they'd munch on chocolate-covered cherries and grapes injected to the point of bursting with brandy and vodka. That does sound kind of awesome. I had my daughter's... Oh, God, I don't like it. It's like, I've got this story I want to bring up about my daughter's birthday party from a couple of months ago. But it's also like, we're in a story about murder, but I'll tell it anyway for some levity. We did it at a chocolate factory. There's this awesome place. If you are in Prague, and especially if you've got kids, even if you're in Prague, there's a chocolate factory called Chocotopia, and they have like a chocolate plantation out in like South America somewhere. And it's got all of the stories about these guys going out there and setting it up and about how they source all of the chocolate and all of this stuff. And then this giant building makes this chocolate and they have so much of it. And you can go there and you can make these different chocolate like shapes and stuff, which is what my daughter's birthday party was about. And then they had this like place where we had like it all set up for a party. And there was so much chocolate that everyone was just ridiculously full of chocolate and we barely even scratched. It was if I was a kid, this would have been my fantasy. Now as a 36-year-old man, I'm like, oh, I better not eat more chocolate. I'm going to regret this. And I did regret it. But it's so good. Chocotopia, everybody. Check it out if you're in Prague. It's not sponsored, it's just amazing. It was quite a change from the days when Dean Corll was a quiet young man who kept no friends. However, if Corll was a psychopath, it's hardly surprising that in adulthood he'd learned to ape acceptable behaviours and mimic personality traits that he observed would win people over and generally transform himself into a charismatic figure. Exactly. That's what I'm saying. As a kid, you don't know how to do that. But then as you get older, these people learn and they're like, oh yeah, you've been on this mask, you've been on that mask, easy. Ted Bundy did much the same thing. And indeed, the confident facade worked. Corll, who continued to suppress his secret homosexuality, became intensely desired by many of his female employees. He'd tease them and keep them at arm's length, but one girl managed to finagle a trip to the beach with him, to her boundless excitement, but was confused and disappointed when Corll pulled up to her house with a van full of kids that he wanted to take with them. Bruh. Weird. Red fucking alert. The girl was furious and vowed to never go on a date with him again. I mean, really? I mean, if you were like, oh yeah, he's taking all the kids to the beach and he's a P word, you'd be like, bro, what the hell? But if he just turns up, he's like, no, I just love supporting the local community. And this is the past. You'd just be like, oh, you're such a good guy. Dean's mother, Mary, who was utterly in denial about her son and had a major blind spot as far as his homosexuality and P-word inclinations were concerned, later explained to the media, quote, he didn't want to show much affection toward women because he wasn't ready to hurt their feelings or take up with them. So he kept kids between them. You're so hardcore in denial, Mary. I mean, this really could get more obvious, but I guess the 1960s were a simpler, more naive time. When his mother tried to line up dates with quote-unquote nice girls, he would get frustrated and tell her to mind her own business. But Corll briefly got a proverbial beard, dating a single mother for a few months named Betty Hawkins. Oh, beard, it means like... I remember learning this. Where does this word come from? Like, a woman who's dating a man so the man can deny he's gay, right? He was really good with her kids and got them to call him Daddy. Meanwhile, there was Helms Elementary School across the street. Every day, like clockwork, there would be a line of cherubic little school kids outside the factory asking for free samples. Without fail, Dean would go out and give candy to them. When their parents complained, Corll ignored them and continued to dispense the candy anyway. He gained a second nickname, the Pied Piper. As Ruby Jenkins, one of Corll's business associates, said, quote, Dean loved kids. I never saw a man who loved kids like Dean. They were always around him, hugging him, and he just loved it. It's like that could go two ways, can't it? He could like, oh, he's like this nice guy, he gives out the chocolate to kids. Or it could be like, who's this guy who gives out chocolate to kids? It's like, yeah, David writes, I'll bet he did. I bet he did. Oh, grim. Corll also set up a pool table in the back of the factory, which attracted a large number of teenage boys who'd come to hang out with Dean after school. See, now that is just a bit... Like, before handing out the chocolate and stuff, it's like, I understand, like, in a simpler time and stuff, that this could be seen as okay, but he's like, no, he's just set up, like, a pool table so teenage boys come and hang out with him. Even if he's not sexually a weirdo, that's still weird. Like, get some friends your own age. He bought a stereo and set it up in his trailer next to the factory, where teenage boys would regularly be seen relaxing and listening to music. He was also constantly taking boys for rides in his windowless white van with a couch inside it, usually on trips to go surfing at the beach. Some of Coral's employees increasingly began to suspect that he was attracted to teenage boys, given how flirtatiously he acted around them. And while allegations from the mid-1960s are pretty thin on the ground, this is quite an obvious pattern of grooming. Coral's criminal activities were already in full swing. The prevailing mystery is how many molestations there were at the time, and exactly when Coral started to torture and murder his victims. We shall never know for certain. One thing we do know is that one of Coral's employees, a teenager only known as Jimmy, refused to be left alone with Coral. When asked why, he would merely hang his head and he wouldn't answer. Another thing that we do know is that Coral spent a lot of time digging behind the candy factory and through the floor of his back office, claiming that he was burying defective candy in order to avoid attracting insects. Bro, that's what bins are for. This is not what he was doing. So we're sure, right? No one listening to this is like, oh yeah, he was really burying candy. No, he's burying bodies, so we know this is when it began. Like, 90% certainty, right? The burials happened entirely at night. Coral would wrap the quote-unquote defective candy in plastic sheeting and would pour concrete on top of it once the internment was done. It's not candy. When Coral ran out of room in the floor of his office and behind the factory, he started burying the quote-unquote candy near White Oak Bayou in an area which was later converted into a parking lot. To this day, neither site has been excavated by forensic investigators. It's pretty clear that Coral started killing in the mid-1960s, which likely makes his total kill count much higher than the one officially ascribed to him. Why haven't they investigated this? It's a parking lot. It's not like you're digging up a skyscraper. Just go demolish the parking lot and plaster over it when you're done. Go find that. What the hell? The twist. In 1966, Mary, now aged 50, got hitched for a fourth time. The man's name has been thoroughly suppressed in most sources for legal reasons because, as you will see, he did not come off particularly well. As such, we'll simply refer to him by the pseudonym Turd Ferguson. If you'll forgive the Norm Macdonald reference. I don't know the Norm Macdonald reference, but the Turd as a name is quite funny. Turd was a merchant seaman who met Mary via a matchmaking service. The nuptials were extremely rushed thereafter. They honeymooned in Mexico City, where Mary was alarmed by Turd being unnecessarily violent with a cab driver. Turd had frequent fits of rage and talked about how he was constantly in conflict with other men. Yeah, what's that saying? It's like you can judge people by how they treat staff. Like, if you're at a restaurant and, like, someone's rude to the waiter, it's like you can, I feel like, unless you're having a terrible experience in the restaurants, then it's like that's a warning sign. According to Mary, he even bragged about how sometimes crewmen would walk off his ships when they found out Turd Ferguson would be serving aboard. Additionally, Turd's first wife had hanged herself in the garage, but the fact that Turd himself had taken the rope off his wife's neck and laid her out on the ground before calling the police made Mary suspicious. Mary, you're married to this dude. What the f*** are you doing? She actually went downtown to look at the coroner's report for signs of foul play, but to no avail. While on a road trip through Indiana to visit Mary's family, Turd Ferguson had a fit of rage while in the car. Mary dumped his ass in a field and drove away. They annulled the marriage shortly thereafter. Good move, Mary. I get the feeling you'd have ended up murdered if you'd have stayed with old Turdy here. However, Turd Ferguson was evidently also something of a sweet talker, because only a few weeks later they remarried and moved in together. Unfortunately, things did not get better. Shocking. It's really shocking. Turd didn't turn himself around, did he? Turd proved himself to be extremely jealous. Once, while offshore in Boston, Turd Ferguson phoned Mary, but she didn't pick up, so he immediately flew to Houston to see if she'd shacked up with another man. Another time, when Turd was supposedly away on a boat, he rented a car and staked out Mary's house for 2 nights. Yet another time, he misdialed their home number and a man answered, so Turd flew into a rage, went home, burst into the room where Mary was sewing, and scared the living daylights out of her. It is possible that it wasn't just paranoid jealousy and Mary was actually cheating on Turd at the time, and there are circumstantial reasons to suspect Mary's track record in her previous marriages, but there obviously isn't anything on the planet that could explain such blatantly toxic and coercive behaviour. Turd was a shit. It is notable, however, that he showed some good judgment of character by taking a thorough dislike to Dean, who, like Jake West before him, Turd thought was a creep and paid far too much attention to children. Yes, Turd might be a turd, but he's right on this. He's not as much of a turd as Dean. The friction between Turd and Dean grew to the point that Dean refused to visit the newly re-weds for Christmas and for Dean's birthday on Christmas Eve. This broke Mary's heart. But there is really very little information to redeem Ted Ferguson in this narrative. The unstable nature of their relationship constantly had Mary leaving the house and moving back in once Turd managed to beg her to return. In one instance, Turd sent Mary 8 bunches of flowers and told her he'd throw the most beautiful funeral for her if she ever died. Oh my god, how romantic. For instance, if she failed to return home and he killed her for it. Oh, that took a turn. By all accounts, Turd Ferguson was a major headache and an abusive arsehole. And in an act of utter hypocrisy, despite all the violent, jealous behaviour, Turd would also openly cheat on Mary when they were on the outs. As their marriage continued, it would only get worse. Meanwhile, in 1967, Dean Corll was still in full flush of his popularity, handing out candy to the kids across the street at Helms Elementary School. One of the students that caught his eye was David Brooks, a 12-year-old 6th grader. Brooks took an immediate liking to Corll because he was the first adult who didn't comment on Brooks's thick-rimmed glasses when Corll met him, which was otherwise something about which Brooks was teased relentlessly by his fellow students and other adults. What adults are teasing the 12-year-olds because of his glasses? You need to get your shit together if you're that adult. Like the other boys, Corll took Brooks for rides on his motorcycle and for trips down to the beach and got him to hang out in the back of the factory playing pool. While Corll and Brooks's relationship did not yet turn out to outright pedestry, it was quite clear that Corll was grooming Brooks. It was becoming clear that Corll Candy Company's finances were on a sharp downturn and that they had severely overestimated the market demand for their candy and overextended themselves. Corll laid off the majority of their staff and did some of the factory work himself, whipping up 5 or 6 batches at night for what few orders the company had. During the day, Corll took a job as a trainee at the Houston Lighting and Power Company, testing relay systems in order to make ends meet. Oh no! I mean, oh no! Corll's lost his money! But it's like, I like the story of this up-and-coming business and how they made it successful and they competed. And now it's like, yeah, there's just a downturn sometimes, doesn't it? It's like, it's not always just a constant march uphill. Meanwhile, the greatest marriage story in human history continued to span the spectrum from to really Mary and Turd began threatening to have each other committed to an insane asylum. Mary actually went ahead and did it, and Turd was kept for 24 hours observation before being released. He then went on to threaten to have Mary committed to a private clinic where he could pay to have her there indefinitely and subjected to shock therapy. Mary was horrified and slept in the office at the candy factory for 6 weeks. She got a restraining order on Turd for good measure. Not to be dissuaded, Turd refused to get a divorce and began lurking around the candy factory, leaving threatening messages on the company answering machine and occasionally trying to break into the place. One night at 2 a.m., Turd Ferguson showed up at the factory and began pounding on the door, yelling that he was going to beat the shit out of Mary and calling Dean a derogatory slur for homosexual. At this point, Mary declared that she was going to shoot Turd, but Dean told her not to and threatened to take away Mary's .22 caliber pistol if she couldn't control herself. Mary then started encouraging Dean to go out and murder him instead. Go on, son, go out there and finish him off. As a happy compromise, Dean gave Mary some bricks to throw at Turd Ferguson from the second floor window. Illustrative of Mary's own state of dial about her son, years later she said to quote, "How could people say now that Dean is a murderer? Why, if Dean was ever going to be a problem to anybody, it would have been to Turd Ferguson." Mary, you are so blind to what is going on, it's not even funny. In June 1968, Mary finally managed to get divorced from Turd on the grounds of both abuse and adultery. A few days later, on advice Mary got from a psychic, she took her now 13-year-old daughter Joyce from a marriage to Jake West and moved to Colorado. This was to avoid further threats from Turd Ferguson, who seemed a pretty likely candidate for someone who'd be violent or even homicidal towards an ex-wife. Dean Corll, meanwhile, remained in Houston, shut down Corll Candy Company for good, and began working full-time at Houston Lighting and Power. He'd never see his mother in person again. Now, despite no longer being the candy man, Dean Corll continued to pal around with underage boys. He moved into a prefabricated shed across the street from Cooley Elementary School. He installed a blacklight, television, and stereo system so it would seem like a cool place for teenagers to hang out. Dude, you're just getting older and they're staying the same age. You're a f***ing weirdo, dude. Now that Corll's mother was out of town, he began to be a little more open about his same-sex attraction, with a small number of older acquaintances, men in their early 20s, but for the most part he still kept it a secret. Corll also regularly caught up on a monthly basis with his old girlfriend Betty Hawkins, but mostly, Corll's choice of companions was decidedly younger. One of them was David Brooks, and from that point forward, they were seen constantly in each other's company. In 1969, when Brooks was 14, their relationship turned sexual, with Corll paying Brooks $5 or $10, $35 to $70 in modern money, or bribing him with gifts to allow Corll to perform oral sex on him. Brooks once specified It was always Dean doing something to me. It was never me doing something to Dean. As 1970 dawned, many of Coral's adult acquaintances noticed a sharp change in his demeanour. He became more isolationist again, like he was in the old days, and he was no longer the charismatic dynamo everyone knew and loved when he managed the factory. The most likely explanation is that he didn't need to wear that mask anymore. Coral was also quick to anger and often threatened people with violence. Furthermore, as Coral turned 30, he became increasingly sensitive about his age and didn't seem to want older companions around anymore. He also started moving constantly to new apartments and houses around Houston. Shortly after he arrived, neighbors would take note of wild parties with loud music attended by young men, and when Coral moved out, a few of his former landlords took notice of bullet holes in the walls. One landlord noticed a steel hook that was typically used to hold a chain or a rope had been affixed to a wall inside the bedroom. Coral moved about 5 or 6 times a year. He explained to his mother that part of the reason was that he wanted to avoid some young men with whom he didn't want to be friends anymore. But what this behavior suggests is that Coral kept on the move to avoid allegations of sexual abuse from mounting up in any particular neighborhood. Yeah, that's bang on, David. That's exactly what's going on. And it's the past, so I guess people weren't brilliant at tying together. I feel like on Facebook, there'd be like the Coral's a Predator group, and people would be like, I've seen him here, he's moved here. Find him, get away, make him move. Meanwhile, David Brooks' parents got a divorce. His father stayed living in Houston, and his mother moved to the nearby town of Beaumont. The now 15-year-old Brooks dropped out of high school and went to Beaumont to live with his mother, but he frequently came back to Houston to visit his father, and quite often, instead of staying with his dad, Brooks stayed wherever Dean Coral was living at the time. He described living with Dean Coral as a second home. In addition to payment for sexual services, Coral was also quick to give Brooks money whenever the teenager asked for it. Then one night, in September 1970, we don't have an exact date, David Brooks paid an unannounced visit to where Coral was staying at the Harold Turboff Apartments, not far from the county orphanage. The door was unlocked. Brooks walked into the living room and saw Dean Coral completely naked, forcibly sodomizing 2 teenage boys who were manacled to a plywood torture board that Coral had suspended from the ceiling. As David Brooks later attested, quote, "They was all 3 of them naked. Dean jumped up and said, 'I'm just having some fun,' and he promised me a car if I kept quiet. Please, I know this isn't where it ends, but this is really where you should go to prison forever." Like, David Brooks should be like, yeah, you need to go and arrest that guy, and I'll tell you, and we'll get those witnesses, and that'll be that. But that's not what happens, is it? David Brooks left. Not long afterward, he met up with Coral again, who admitted to the younger man that he had tortured and murdered the 2 teenagers. But Coral went further. He proposed a deal with Brooks. For every teenage boy that David Brooks could lure to his apartment, Coral would pay Brooks $200, or roughly $1,500 in modern money. Confronted with this horrifying revelation and Coral's equally grotesque proposal, quite surprisingly, David Brooks actually accepted. And yes, that's insane, but also we've got to remember that David Brooks has been fairly heavily groomed for a very long time. Not that that's really much of an excuse, but Jesus, so where's he getting so much money from? He just works in an electric company. The Accomplice.
Jesus.
On Friday, September the 15th, 1970, around the same time that Dean Coral made his ghoulish offer to David Brooks, 18-year-old Jeffrey Conan, a student at the University of Texas in the city of Austin, was hitchhiking back to Houston to visit his parents for the weekend. Conan's college roommate, Juan Lopez, was also heading to Houston for the weekend. He accompanied Conan as they leapfrogged from ride to ride, each provided by kindly strangers on their 165-mile journey back home. The last ride they received was from a man named Legrand. Along the way, Legrand's car blew a tire, and so Lopez and Conan helped him change it. Afterward, Legrand drove them to a bar in Houston and bought them a drink to thank them. At 6:15 p.m., Legrand dropped off Conan at the corner of Westheimer and South Voss in a posh business and shopping district in Houston called Uptown. Lopez stayed in the car, and Legrand drove him home. This is the last time Conan was seen alive. Oh, Legrand is Coral, isn't he? Jeffrey Conan was approximately 130 pounds or 59 kilograms with blonde hair and blue eyes. He wore a blue t-shirt, brown jeans, and a yellow raincoat. He was carrying a red plaid bowling bag in his pockets and had a scholarship check for $250, or just shy of $2,000 in modern money. Conan was short and looked decidedly young for his age, which explains why Coral targeted him. Conan did not live in Uptown, and his roommate Lopez had no idea what he intended to do there, later stating that he knew Conan had definitely intended to make his way home. The most likely scenario is that Conan bought something in Uptown and then hitched another ride to take him the rest of the way home. Unfortunately, the vehicle he entered was likely driven by Dean Coral. When Conan did not arrive home, his parents reported him missing, only to be told by police that he was likely a runaway, had possibly run off to California like so many youth were doing at the time, and would quote-unquote probably turn up. Brilliant police work there, well done. Fearing a robbery gone wrong, Conan's parents scoured bank records to see if anyone had cashed their son's scholarship check, but to no avail. Conan's body was found 3 days later, buried at High Island Beach. The body had been wrapped in plastic sheeting covered with a layer of lime, and a large boulder had been pushed on top of the shallow grave, further concealing it and preventing wildlife from digging it up. Conan's hands and feet had been bound with a nylon cord, and a gag had been stuffed in his mouth. He had been forcibly sodomized, tortured, and killed by strangulation. David Brooks knew where he was buried. And although the Candyman had been likely operating for years at this point, Jeffrey Conan is the earliest known victim of Dean Corll. Well, go dig up that f***ing parking lot then, if you really want to know. On September the 17th, 1970,
what about
Dean
those
Corll
2 or
rented
3
a
ones that
boat
he killed
shed from
earlier?
Mayner, proprietor, the woman from the beginning, the boat shed, the storage room with the car of Southwest Boat Storage on the outskirts of Houston for $20 a month. On December the 13th, 1970, two 14-year-olds from the Spring Branch district in Houston, named James Glass and Danny Yates, were at a religious rally at the Evangelistic Temple at Church in Houston Heights. James Glass's father also attended the rally, along with James's brother Willie. Sometime during the rally, David Brooks turned up. Brooks and Glass knew each other, and previously, Brooks had convinced Glass to attend a party at Dean Corll's apartment. Brooks managed to lure James Glass and Danny Yates away from the rally without informing anyone where they were going or with whom. The last time Willie Glass saw his brother and Yates, they were walking up the aisle of the church, as if they were headed to the restroom. And then, as Willie later said, they just vanished into thin air. David Brooks had successfully lured the two 14-year-olds into the hands of Dean Corll, who at that point had moved into an apartment in Yorktown. Corll began plying the two boys with drugs and alcohol. His usual modus operandi was, if he could convince his victims to drink and do drugs, to get them highly intoxicated or passed out so that he could easily restrain them. If he couldn't tempt the boys, Corll would trick the victims into putting on handcuffs by offering to show them an escape artist trick, in a tactic later copied by John Wayne Gacy. If that failed, Corll would use outright physical coercion. In this case, booze was enough though. Brooks was paid $400, or roughly $3,000 in today's money, and he left before any of the torture and violence began. Dean Corll manacled the two teenagers to a torture board suspended from the ceiling, gagged them, and once the boys regained consciousness, he forcibly sodomized them. Danny Yates was also tortured for an unknown duration with electricity from jumper cables hooked up to a generator. Then both boys were strangled to death with a nylon ligature. Dean Corll wrapped them in plastic sheeting, placed them in the trunk of his car, drove them to the outskirts of Houston, and buried them in the back of his boat shed. David Brooks assisted with the burial. David Brooks is in this crazy journey. When the Glass and Yates families reported their sons missing, the police told them that without any evidence of foul play, no search would be conducted. Glass and Yates' cases were handed over to the Missing Persons Department, where two different officers were assigned to each boy. The cases were then lost in a morass of bureaucracy, and the disappearances of the two boys were treated separately rather than as connected occurrences. Glass was classified as a runaway almost immediately because he'd once stormed out of the house after an argument with his father over the length of his hair. Glass had stayed the night with friends before returning home. Police thought that this was sufficient grounds to assume that he had run away again. Yates was classified as a runaway a few days later when police learned that he used to hang out at a house that was notorious for being frequented by runaway boys. Apparently, this was also sufficient to slap the runaway label on him and do nothing further. Yes, I mean, I know the police are busy and stuff, but missing kids, come on guys. The Glass and Yates families were on their own. They papered the town with missing persons flyers. Willie Glass ran an appeal directly to his brother in the newspaper. Even he assumed James was a runaway and begged him to return home, even offering to buy James a motorcycle if he did so. Danny Yates' father, meanwhile, drove down all the way to Monterrey in Mexico, about 500 miles away, due to a dubious tip that Danny Yates had been seen there. Meanwhile, James's mother, Ina Glass, became mentally ill from the anxiety and grief. She began hallucinating that she saw James by the side of the road whenever she was in the car. Things escalated, but she obtained a gun, grabbed her daughter Pamela, and dragged her into her bedroom. When police arrived, she screamed at them that they weren't going to take her daughter like they'd taken her son. Ina was disarmed, without anyone being hurt, and she was sent to a psychiatric ward, where she remained institutionalized for several months. Yeah, I can see. It's like this sort of like can break people. Shortly after the murders of James Glass and Danny Yates, Dean Corll moved again. This time from his Yorktown apartment to a flat in Mangum Road. Not far away from Corll's apartment was a bowling alley, the Del Mar Lanes. On January the 30th, 1971, 15-year-old Donald Waldrop and his 13-year-old brother Jerry were walking to the Del Mar lanes discussing the prospect of starting a bowling league. They had been dropped off by their father at a friend's house nearby, but after discovering that their friend wasn't home, the brothers headed off on foot without him. Somewhere along the way, Donald and Jerry were approached by David Brooks, who asked the boys if they wanted to smoke some weed. Brooks led them to a white windowless van where Coral was waiting. After getting the Waldrop boys stoned, Coral enticed them back to his apartment with promise of a party and more illicit substances. Once there, Donald and Jerry were plied with alcohol. This time David Brooks stayed to watch what was about to unfold. Coral manacled the brothers to his torture board and sexually assaulted them for the next several hours. During the ordeal, both boys were subjected to genital mutilation. Coral kept the victims shackled to the torture board while he and Brooks went to sleep. The next morning, Coral cuffed each brother by one hand and one leg to the torture board, leaving Donald and Jerry with one hand free. Coral then informed the boys that whichever Waldrop brother beat their sibling to death would be unchained and allowed to leave. For the next several hours, Coral and Brooks watched the boys struggle to kill each other with their fists while dangling from the torture board, several times beating each other into a state of unconsciousness. Then Coral sexually assaulted the victims again, before strangling them both to death. Brooks helped Coral wrap the victims in plastic and bury them in a common grave in the back left-hand corner of the boat shed. This is intense.
Dude,
the boys' father, Everett Waldrop, reported both of them missing, only to be told by the police that they were probably runaways. After so many kids going missing, so many, same demo. After attempting for 8 months to convince the police to take the matter seriously, Everett Waldrop was told to stop wasting police time. Jesus Christ. He's a father whose kid's gone missing. And the police are like, stop wasting our time. Can you imagine? Can you fucking
beat the
imagine?
shit out of that cop.
True to his word last September, in exchange for Brooks keeping quiet, Dean Coral bought the teenager a green 1969 Chevrolet Corvette. It was through driving this vehicle that Brooks became acquainted with a 15-year-old part-time gas station attendant named Randall Harvey. Brooks and Harvey later quarreled over stolen stereo equipment, and during the argument, Brooks threatened to kill him. It turns out that Brooks was serious. On March the 9th, 1971, Randall Harvey was riding home on his bike after finishing his shift at the gas station. Somewhere between the gas station and his home in the suburb of Oak Forest, Harvey was forced by Dean Coral and David Brooks into Coral's windowless white van. Harvey's bike was thrown into the van after him, and it was later discarded, never to be found. Randall Harvey's hands and feet were bound with nylon cord, and he was carried into Coral's apartment on Magnum Road. Once inside, Dean Coral sodomized, tortured, and murdered Randall Harvey with a single gunshot to the head. Brooks was satisfied that it settled the score with Harvey, which softened the blow that he wasn't paid his usual $200 fee. The victim was buried in the back of Coral's boat shed. Randall Harvey's mother reported him missing 2 days later. She mentioned to the police that Harvey had quarreled with a 16-year-old teenager named David Brooks over stolen stereo equipment. Police didn't look into the lead and insisted that Harvey was probably a fucking runaway, perhaps to get away from Brooks. Brooks was not questioned, and no search for Randall Harvey was conducted at the time. When his body was unearthed in the boat shed in 1973, it was not identified because a house fire had destroyed all of Randall Harvey's pictures and the boy did not have dental records. By this point, Harvey's mother was reluctant to participate further in the investigation, saying that she knew her son was dead and didn't want to put herself through the trauma of the identification process only to find out that it wasn't him. Then, in 2008, Randall Harvey's sister submitted their DNA to be tested against locks of hair from one of the unidentified bodies in Coral's boat shed. It was a match. And so, 37 years after his death, Randall Harvey's body was released by Houston police to his family. His sisters had him cremated, and his ashes scattered at the same lake where they had scattered their grieving mother after she died in 1994. Randall's sister Lenore said, quote, "He needs to be fishing with Mama. He's had a hard enough life." When discussing Coral's pattern of killing and the suffering of his victims, Brooks later said, quote, "Every once in a while, he'd take a kid by force, and then he'd do oral sex and rectal sex and all kinds of other things. And then he'd wind up killing them. Once they went to the board, they were as good as dead. It was all over, except for the shouting and the crying. This is probably a cruel way to put it. It probably sounds terrible. But most of them weren't no great loss. Yeah, Brooks, it sounds f***ing terrible, you piece of shit. It's like, why would you f***ing say that? It probably sounds terrible, so don't f***ing say it. A parent's worst nightmare. At 2 p.m. on May the 29th, 1971, 13-year-old David Hillergeist left home with his little brothers to go swimming in the community pool, which was about a mile away. However, shortly after leaving his house, Hillergeist decided he was too embarrassed to go to the pool with his little brothers. He swung by his neighbor's house to see if his friend, 16-year-old Gregory Winkle, would like to go with him instead. David Hillergeist was skinny and small for his age, being only 5'3" and not yet 100 pounds. Although 3 years older, Gregory Winkle was also slender and small for his age, standing at 5'7". Thus, both boys made ideal targets for Dean Corll. Winkle and Hillergeist didn't make it to the pool. They were last seen by witnesses climbing into a white windowless van. Of course, this van was driven by Corll. Winkle and Hillergeist required no coercion to get inside. Both of them knew Corll. Gregory Winkle had worked part-time at Corll Candy Company alongside his mother Selma. David Hillergeist had often hung out at the factory, being among the many teenagers invited to use the pool table at the back. Thus, Dean Corll, the Candyman, had no trouble convincing the two boys to accompany him to his apartment, where he got them intoxicated, then shackled, tortured, and forcibly sodomized them. This assault lasted for several hours, during which sharp objects were shoved into their rectum and glass rods were inserted into their urethras before being smashed with blunt force. At 11:30 p.m., Corll forced Gregory Winkle to phone his mother Selma, who'd just gotten home from work, to discover that her phone was ringing. Under duress, Gregory said, quote, "Mama, I called because I know you'd be worried." Selma Winkle asked her son where he was. Gregory didn't immediately answer, but he could be heard whispering a question to someone on the other end of the line. She heard the other person answer, but couldn't make out what they'd said. Then Gregory put his mouth back to the receiver and replied, "We're in Freeport, Mama. I called to let you know where I was at." Selma thought this was odd because Gregory had often traveled to Freeport, a small seaside town approximately 60 miles or 100 kilometers from downtown Houston. Gregory knew the place like the back of his hand. There was no reason he'd need to ask someone on the other end of the line where he was. Selma asked Gregory who he was with, and he replied, "I'm out with some kids." "What kids?" Selma asked. "Oh, just some kids. With my friend Joe and some kids." "Are there any girls?" Selma asked with a note of disapproval in her voice. "No, Mama," Gregory replied. "There's just a bunch of boys and having a swim out here. You know better than to be out this late," Selma said angrily.
Why the fuck wouldn't he just take the time to say, "Hey, I'm kidding him"?
And David Hillergeist to death. He then wrapped the boys in plastic sheeting, drove them out to the Southwest Boat Storage and buried them in the back right-hand corner of his shed alongside Randall Harvey. David was buried in the fetal position. Gregory was buried sitting up. It's just... How have we not heard... Like, this guy he's like killing more people than Ted Bundy. In horrific ways. And it's in America. How has this not come up? How is this guy not as infamous as Gacy?
Yeah, what
Earlier
the
that day,
fuck?
at 3 p.m., David Hillergeist's mother had found out that her son was missing only an hour after he had left because one of David's little brothers had called asking to be picked up from the pool. The little boys had walked there without David and had never shown up subsequently. A few anxious hours passed, then at 7 p.m., Dorothy and her husband Fred began sweeping the neighborhood, calling out David's name, banging on doors, neighbors, and when that failed, the doors of strangers. But they notably missed Selma Winkle because she had not come home from work yet. Dorothy and Fred continued to search the area until 3 a.m. when they began phoning hospitals in case David had met with some kind of accident. But none of the hospitals they called had any record of admitting a boy of his description. At 6 a.m., the Hillergeists called the police and reported David missing. They were told not to worry, and that David had probably just spent the night at a friend's house. When the officer was assured that David was not at any of his friends' houses and that he wasn't the sort of boy to do that sort of thing, the cop speculated that David had probably run away. Oh, what a surprise that a cop would speculate that rather than doing any work. The officer then informed the Hillergeists that unless there was evidence of foul play, a search would not be conducted. At that point, David was already dead. Dorothy and Fred spent May 30th searching across Houston. In the late afternoon,
Oh man, what a bunch of incompetent cops.
An hour-alarm Selma told the Hillergeists that David and Gregory had headed off to the pool together, and that at 11:30 that night, Gregory had phoned her saying that he was in Freeport. Selma also doubted that her son had simply run away. Gregory had left the house in swimming trunks with only 80 cents in his pocket. Selma was also widowed and depended on the 16-year-old Gregory to help her make ends meet. Gregory had always been very loving and attentive towards his mother, and Selma thought it doubtful that he would just up and abandon her. Without delay, Fred and Dorothy Hillergeist headed to Freeport, a town of 12,000 people, and showed David's photo to anyone who would talk to them. Nobody had seen their son. Going 4 days without any sleep whatsoever, Fred and Dorothy chased up several rumors and investigated hundreds of miles of Texas coastline and the wider Houston area. On Wednesday, June 2nd, they hired a private investigator who searched for 3 weeks, found nothing, and hit the Hillergeists with a bill for $1,100 or $8,700 in modern money, sending the family into debt. They didn't care. They just wanted their son back. Yeah, I mean, fair. Like 3 weeks' work, 8,700. It's not like he's trying to rip them off. He's just doing his job. And I'd do exactly the same thing. I'd be like, I'd hire all the people I could find. If the police aren't going to do it, I'll do it myself. Meanwhile, Fred and Dorothy Hillergeist and Selma Winkle had printed off 500 missing posters with pictures and descriptions of the two boys and the offer of a $1,000 reward. The anxious parents got the entire community to come out and distribute them across Houston. Among the volunteers was David Hillergeist's childhood friend, 15-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley. He reassured Dorothy, quote, "Don't worry, Mrs. Hillergeist. David could be right under your nose, and you wouldn't even realize it." He then offered to take one of David's younger brothers fishing someday. Dorothy took notes that at the time, Elmer Wayne Henry seemed like he'd been drinking. Ooh, what's going on here? The search continued. David's sister Cynthia and her boyfriend spent countless nights driving all over Houston looking for him. The Hillergeists and Selma Winkle went further into debt in order to run ads in the local newspapers. Dorothy wrote to the National Enquirer tabloid to bring attention to David's case. She also wrote to the National Missing Youth Locator, a periodical devoted to information sharing on missing children in the days before the internet. Finally, out of desperation, Dorothy turned to the shameless lies of so-called clairvoyance. The first one said that David was dead in a South Texas town. The next said he was alive and well in Dallas. The next said that David was lying in hospital with amnesia and facing south. And the next said that he was enjoying jazz music on Bourbon Street in New Orleans. Fred Hillergeist actually travelled to both Dallas and New Orleans and predictably found nothing in clairvoyance. They're taking money that these people could be using on actual private investigators. Meanwhile, the Winkle and Hillergeist phone lines were clogged for weeks with crank calls and bogus tips. Also, those people. Dorothy Hillergeist did, however, stumble upon a genuine lead. She learned that Gregory Winkle had an older friend in his late 20s or early 30s who owned a white van and also a Plymouth GTX. Nobody knew his name or could describe him, but a Plymouth GTX had been suspiciously prowling the neighborhood in the weeks following David and Gregory's disappearance. Concerned neighbors, already on high alert, had jotted down the license plate number, TMF 724. Dorothy passed the information on to the police, who did absolutely nothing with it. Admittedly, the lead was quite tenuous, but if the police had looked into it just out of due diligence, they would have discovered that the vehicle belonged to Dean Corral, a man who was friendly with both David Hillergeist and Gregory Winkle. But there's never any chance of that happening. The police weren't investigating the disappearance of the two boys at all. The Twist, Part 2. In July 1971, Dean Corral moved to a new apartment on San Felipe Street. As before, the neighbors noticed that loud music was constantly issuing from the place, and that teenage boys were always coming and going in various stages of intoxication. Many of them had long hair and were shabbily dressed. And many of them behaved like total delinquents. Indeed, some of them did have juvenile criminal records, and others were outright rent boys. Corral himself, however, made a better impression. He did not dress like a hippie or a party animal. He looked clean-cut and respectable. Corral was always polite to his neighbors and full of apologies about the noise, and he always seemed to be in the company of one young man, David Brooks, who was a semi-permanent fixture at the place. On the afternoon of August the 17th, 1971, 17-year-old Reuben Watson Hanley asked his grandmother if he could go to the movies. She said yes and gave him $2.75. As an afterthought, Reuben's grandmother tossed him a couple of extra dimes in case he needed to call her via a payphone. Before leaving for the cinema, Reuben used the home phone to call his mother, who was at work, and told him he'd be back by the time she returned at 7:30. Reuben had a juvenile record, so his mother liked to keep close tabs on him. Reuben left to see Omega Man starring Charlton Heston. In the early evening, after the movie was finished, Reuben was walking home from the cinema when he encountered David Brooks. Reuben knew him from the days when they used to hang around the Coral Candy Company with a large number of other boys. Brooks wasted no time in inviting Reuben to a party at Dean Corral's new place. Corral was known to Reuben as the Candy Man, who used to give out free confectionery, take kids on motorbike rides, and take them surfing at the beach. As such, it didn't take much convincing for Reuben to head off with Brooks for a bit of a party. Yeah, like more innocent times, right? Nowadays, it's like, oh no, it's the nice old man who gives out candy. Be like, hello. What? At 7:30 p.m., Reuben's mother arrived home to find that her son had not yet returned. Shortly thereafter, an audibly intoxicated Reuben phoned her to tell her that he'd be spending the night at quote-unquote David Brooks's place. Then Reuben abruptly hung up. Not long after, he was restrained, forcibly sodomized, and tortured. Brooks stayed around to watch the proceedings. Corral had stopped paying him his $200 fee, but Brooks didn't seem to care anymore. Brooks later claimed that Reuben Haney was the first killing that he'd observed, but this was either a lie or a misremembering of the order of the murders, because David Brooks had at least observed the torture and murder of the Waldrop brothers back in January and likely observed the murder of Randall Harvey in March. At the very least, he participated in Harvey's abduction. Either way, this time, David Brooks watched Coral strangle Reuben Haney and assisted the older man in burying the victim's body in the fetal position in the back of his boat shed. When Reuben's mother told the police that her son had claimed he was at David Brooks' place the night he disappeared, they didn't bother to question Brooks. Reuben was a runaway, end of story. No! Police, what the How many children have to disappear for you to fucking do something? We have very little information about the next two murders, which occurred sometime in the autumn of 1971. No bodies were ever uncovered dating back to that time, and no names of the victims were ever identified. We're instead entirely dependent on the vague and chronologically jumbled testimony of David Brooks. We know that they happened after Dean Coral had moved to a new apartment on Columbia Street in September 1971. One of the two murders was of a boy whom Coral and Brooks picked up on the corner of 11th and Rutland Street. We do not know how old he was. Coral and Brooks tortured the victim for 4 days before they killed him. Brooks, as usual, assisted in his burial, but could not remember where it was. Brooks added, quote, "It really upset Dean to have to kill this boy because he really liked him." The second murder from this period was of a boy whom Brooks mistook for James Glass, who had been killed several months earlier on January the 30th. Instead, the unidentified boy, in the autumn of 1971, had attended a party at Coral's before Brooks had driven him home in his Corvette. However, when they arrived at the boy's house, he refused to get out and demanded to be taken back to the party. And so, to quote David Brooks directly, "I took him back, and Dean ended up killing him." Around November or December 1971, Brooks managed to lure Elmer Wayne Henley to Dean Coral's apartment. Henley was 15 years old and a childhood friend of David Hillergeist, having volunteered to put up missing flyers back in early June. Henley was a promising student, constantly getting A's and B's, and once testing with an IQ of 120. He was also extremely popular with girls, and was constantly entering into short-lived romances and early pubescent sexual encounters with them. But when Henley's mother Mary, who worked as a parking lot attendant, divorced Henley's alcoholic father in 1970, the boy was forced to take odd jobs to help his mother keep the household afloat and support his 3 other siblings. Thereafter, wait, what age do you have to be in school? Is this like one of those things where it's like people are going to be like, "Oh, Simon, you're so ignorant. You don't know how the real world works." It's like, but it's a genuine question. When you're 15, don't you have to be in school? When do you have to be in school in America until like 16? I think that's what it is in the UK, or it was in the UK when I was younger. I think it might now be 18. You can't just go and work an odd job at 15 and drop out of school, can you? You need like the basic education. Thereafter, Henley started drinking, and his grades plummeted to D's and F's. In the spring of 1971, Henley made the acquaintance of David Brooks, who was now 16 years old, and the two teenagers occasionally skipped school to go drinking together. Oh, okay, so he's working and school at the same time. And also drinking. That same year, Henley was charged in juvenile court for assault with a deadly weapon. In June 1971, Henley dropped out of school altogether. Henley was aware that David Brooks frequently hung out with an older man in his 30s and even met Coral in public once or twice, but kept his distance. Henley immediately suspected that Coral was gay. Henley believed at the time that David Brooks was straight, so he thought that Brooks was simply using Coral for his money, or as Henley put it, quote, hustling himself a queer. Then, in November or December of 1971, Wayne Henley was convinced by David Brooks to go to Coral's apartment and do some drinking. Dean Coral had intended to torture and murder him like the others, but as they relaxed and chatted, Coral took a shine to Henley. Coral claimed that he was a thief and asked Henley if he'd like to earn a couple of extra bucks. Over the next few weeks, Coral, Brooks, and Henley committed 3 house burglaries together. Henley handed over his share to his mother. During one of the robberies, Coral asked Henley if he'd be willing to kill if necessary, to which Henley replied in the affirmative. Oh no, Coral's building his little gang of psychos, isn't he? Not long afterward, Henley was drinking again at Coral's apartment when the older man claimed he worked for a child trafficking ring based in Dallas. Oh my god, he's really escalating, isn't it? I mean, it's like grooming for crime. It's like, yeah, no, we'll just start with a little house robbery, it's fine. And then it's like, would you be okay to murder? And it's like, yeah, now we're doing child trafficking. It's like, what's next? Oh yeah, I've got a little genocide going on. Jesus. Coral told Henley that he would pay him $200 for every boy that Henry lured to Coral's apartment. Again, where is he getting this money from? Oh, I guess like the robberies and stuff, so it's a big circle of crime. Wayne Henley said he was inwardly disgusted at the idea, but didn't dare show it and politely declined Coral's proposal. He ignored Brooks and Coral's repetition of the offer for several months, but Henley did not stop hanging out with Brooks and Coral, and gradually came to view the latter as an elder brother type figure. It's like, bro, I don't understand how that works. It's like, would you like to be involved in our child trafficking ring? And inside, you're like, bro, that's fucking sick. What the fuck? And then you're like, yeah, but we'll continue to be mates. I just don't want to be involved in your horrible crimes. But we're still friends. Let's just not talk about business. What? You can't divorce those two things. If someone does a job that you don't like, fine. Like, I don't know, maybe someone's a telemarketer who phones up people and sells them like double glazing or whatever, and you're infuriated by these people. You can still hang out with that person, fine. But when they say like, oh yeah, no, what's your day job? Oh, I'm a child trafficker. Then it's like, no, you can't divorce those two things from each other. What's going on? Meanwhile, by early 1972, the financial situation of the Henley household had become so precarious that Henley changed his mind and told Corral that he would do it. He'd find some kids for him. Dean Corral moved to 925 Schuyler Street on February the 19th, 1972. Henley testified that sometime in late February or early March, he picked up an unidentified victim on the corner of 11th and Studewood Street and lured him back to Corral's apartment to smoke some weed. On Corral's instruction, Henley offered to show the boy a magic trick. Henley cuffed his own hands behind his back, and using a key he had hidden in his back pocket, Henley miraculously freed himself. The boy's hands were cuffed in order to learn the trick, but Corral swiftly pushed the victim over and bound his feet with a nylon cord. Corral then gagged and blindfolded him. At that point, Henley exited the apartment, thinking he'd delivered the unidentified victim to a sex trafficking ring. The next day, Corral paid Henley $200. Jesus. And this is also like, now, even if he wants to go to the police, he can't, because that's got to be like life in prison, right? That sort of thing. Even if he's like, oh no, it's just going to child trafficking. That's life. A month later, on March the 24th, 1972, 18-year-old Frank Aguirre was finishing up his shift at Long John Silver's restaurant on Yale Street. He called the house of his girlfriend, Rhonda Williams, and told her that he'd be there in about 20 minutes. As Frank was walking out to his 1967 Dodge Rambler, he was approached by Wayne Henley. They knew each other and were friendly. Henley brought Frank over to a white van parked nearby and introduced him to Corral and Brooks. They invited Frank to join them at Corral's apartment to smoke some weed and drink some beer. Frank accepted and drove his Dodge Rambler behind Corral's white van. He's 18. Isn't he a little older than Corral's demographic? Oof. After arriving at the apartment, Frank got high and was convinced by Corral to learn a handcuff trick. When Frank's hands were cuffed behind his back, Corral pushed him onto the table and began to torture and sexually assault him. Henley claims that he begged Corral not to harm Frank, but Corral refused and revealed to Henley for the first time that the previous victim Henley had lured to Corral's apartment had not been trafficked. Corral had straight up murdered him. Corral informed Henley that he intended to do the same to Frank. Henley then left the apartment. Frank had a cloth placed inside the mouth and tape wrapped around his head to the point that it covered his nose. You're in such a fucking pickle, mate. Like, you deserve it because you're a piece of shit. But this guy, how would you deal with this? It's like you're locked in, because if you even anonymously tip off the police, he's going to roll over on you because he's going to know you did it. And then you're fucked. So you're fucked if you tell. You got to go to the cops and cut a deal, right? You got to go to a lawyer and be like, I know something extremely fucked up. I'm involved in it. I need a deal, and I will give you a child murderer who's had many victims, and I will take you to them. That sort of thing, right? That's your path out, right? Or at least you got to talk to a lawyer. You got to be like, yo, dude, I need help, my dude. Please tell me what to do. In addition, a ligature was placed around Frank's throat. However, because the tape covered the victim's nose, he quickly suffocated within minutes before enduring the prolonged torture that was Corral's usual MO. Henley returned the next day to help bury the victim at High Island Beach and to help Corral and Brooks move and dismantle Frank's Dodge Rambler, which had been parked outside Corral's apartment so that the parts could be discarded or sold for scrap. A few months after the murder, Henley swung by Frank's mother's house and asked if there were any updates on her son's disappearance. Henley also accepted some missing persons flyers from Frank's mother, promising to post them, but he dumped them in a ditch shortly after he left the house. Why are you doing that, you psycho? On April the 20th, 1972, Corral, Henley and Brooks were partying at Corral's apartment with 17-year-old Mark Scott, who for the past several years had hung out with Henley and Brooks, and by extension, Corral. Henley once came over to Mark's place for a house party, and his mother described Henley as the first to arrive and the last to leave. Brooks used to have sleepovers with Scott when they were younger, and on another occasion accidentally shot Scott in the leg. Oh, with a pellet gun. Okay. Sending Scott to the emergency room. Oh my god, how close range was that? Mark Scott had a juvenile, one of the grimmest things I remember, like at school. Someone had like a BB gun, and you definitely weren't supposed to have a BB gun at school. And he shot someone, or he accidentally shot himself. I can't remember quite what it was. Like in this part of the hand, you know, that soft skin between the thumb and the index finger, and this BB like entered into his skin and like went down, I don't know, maybe an inch or two into his hand. And then it was like just like under his skin in there, and it was like all bloody, and he had to push it out. It's like, oh, dude, grim. Is a pellet gun a BB gun? Is that the same thing? Mark Scott had a juvenile record and was most recently in hot water with the police after being caught carrying a concealed weapon, a knife. Mark had told his parents that he was considering spending a few weeks down in Mexico just to escape police pressure for a while. Dude, you just got what pressure? Is like that you had to conceal. Surely that's an open and shut case. You're gonna flee to Mexico because they caught you carrying a knife. That's not a flee to Mexico sort of crime, unlike pretty much everything else mentioned in today's episode. On the night of the 20th at Dean Corll's apartment, Mark Scott resisted Corll's attempts to slap him in cuffs and then pulled out a knife. Scott managed to slash out at Corll, inflicting a surface wound on Corll's stomach. Nice. However, Wayne Henley brandished a gun at Scott, and to quote Brooks, he just kind of gave up. Scott was manacled to the torture board, and Corll set about his usual MO while Brooks and Henley observed. The torture lasted all night. Sometime during this, Corll forced Scott to write a postcard to his parents, claiming that he'd gone to Austin and found a job that paid $3 an hour. The following morning, Corll showed Henley how to strangle a person with a ligature, and according to Brooks, it was Wayne Henley who actually murdered Mark Scott. Brooks claimed that he couldn't remember where they decided to bury Scott's body, whereas Henley said Scott was buried at Higher Line Beach, but his remains were never found there. Meanwhile, due to the postcard that Corll sent to Scott's parents, police quickly classified him as yet another runaway case. I mean, even if there wasn't a postcard, they'd just be like, even if his room was covered in blood, they'd be like, oh, it looks like he ran away. Another runaway. So many. Pass me a donut. Scott's parents doubted the postcard's authenticity, since Scott would never leave for Austin without his motorbike. On May the 21st, 1972, two more youths who were known to Corll, Brooks and Henley were lured to Corll's apartment. 17-year-old Billy Bolsher had a few years before sold candy door-to-door for the Corll Candy Company. Bolsher, along with his best friend, 16-year-old Johnny DeLome, had frequently hung out together over the years at Corll's various residences. In addition, David Brooks was known to have sold weed to Bolsher. The two boys were walking to the corner store on the morning of the 21st to buy themselves some Coca-Colas when they were lured to Dean Corll's apartment on Schuler Street. This time, the victims were tied to Corll's bed, where they were tortured and sexually assaulted. Sometime during the ordeal, Balcher and DeLome were forced to write letters to their parents saying that they'd found a job working a shipping route from Houston to Washington and would be back in 3 or 4 weeks. Once Corll had finished with the victims, Henley, whom Brooke described as increasingly sadistic, strangled Billy Bolsher to death with his bare hands. Then Henley brandished a .22 caliber pistol and turned to DeLome and gleefully shouted, "Hey Johnny," before shooting Johnny DeLome in the head. The bullet did not kill him, and so Henley climbed over and strangled DeLome to death while the victim was begging for his life. They were buried at High Island, but Bolcher's body was never recovered. 3 days later, Bolcher and DeLome's parents received the letters that their sons had written under duress. Billy's father was a trucker and knew that no Houston to Washington route existed, but the police, as usual, classified them as runaways and offered no help. Man, what are the police actually doing with their lives? This is ridiculous. When Wayne Henley later spoke of his transformation from a reluctant accomplice to callous murderer within just a few short months, he said, quote, "At first I wondered what it was like to kill someone. Later I became fascinated with how much stamina people have. I mean, you see people getting strangled on television and it looks easy. It's not. Sometimes it takes 2 people half an hour. Bro, Wayne Henley, you better be going to the fucking chair, along with Dean Corll and this other Brooks chap. I'd like it if they killed all of you. This is the 70s, right? Where are we? We're in the South, I feel. Yeah. They're gonna get executed. That's gonna be a nice ending, I hope. Mama. Sometime in June 1972, Corll, Brooks and Henley lured 19-year-old Billy Ridinger to the Schuler Street apartment. There, Ridinger was allegedly tortured and sexually assaulted by Corll. However, David Brooks convinced Corll to let Ridinger go. He was unstrapped from the torture board and walked out of the apartment. Bro, what are you doing? That seems like an absolutely insane thing to do, but maybe there's a good reason. Brooks later said, "I took care of him while he was there, and I believe the only reason he is still alive is because I convinced them not to kill him. It's unclear exactly what convinced Coral to let Ridginger go, and it's equally unclear why Ridginger did not go to the police afterwards. Bro? Theories range from Ridginger being too traumatized by the events and just wanting to put them behind him, to theories about how Ridginger may have been allegedly involved with some of Coral's criminal activities and not wanting to attract police attention. You gotta cut a deal, my dude. Like, that's how it works. Like, I don't know what activities, if it's burglary or even something slightly worse than that, you need to go to the police and work out how to get a deal and get these people put away. And by put away, I mean put away in the ground. Because they're dead after being executed. God, I love America. They can kill people. They'll just kill people. Yeah. America. There is no hard evidence either way, only speculations from people who knew him. Ridginger had remained tight-lipped about the case over the years. Rhonda Williams, Frank Aguirre's girlfriends, said, quote, "I can't speak of Ridginger and Dean's relationship prior to that day for legal and personal reasons." Shortly thereafter, Coral's eye turned toward David Brooks. One day in June, the trio was entering the Schuler Street apartment. Henley managed to knock Brooks unconscious. Brooks was tied to the bed, and Coral forcibly sodomized him multiple times. To quote Brooks, "I begged Dean not to kill me, and he finally let me go." Despite being attacked, David Brooks continued to act as one of Coral's accomplices, albeit more sparingly. According to Brooks, Henley and Coral also murdered one more unidentified victim at the Schuler address. Brooks just walked in and found the victim being tortured, but left again before Henley and Coral murdered the unnamed youth. Yo, David Brooks, what the f*** are you doing? Like, you're a piece of shit, and I hope you go to prison forever and also get executed. At that point, you gotta go, my man. You gotta go to, like, Lebanon and get plastic surgery and change your face and buy a passport off the dark web or something, because your clock is ticking. Like, you can't go to the police because you'll be killed. Like, even if you cut a deal, you're going to prison forever because you've done horrible, horrible things. So you gotta flee, my dude. On June the 26th, 1972, Coral moved from Schuler Street to an apartment at Westcott Towers. Shortly before midnight, on July the 19th, Coral lured 17-year-old Stephen Sickman, who was just leaving a house party, to his apartment. Coral caved in the victim's chest by hitting him repeatedly with a sledgehammer. It is not believed that Brooks or Henley participated in this particular murder, since neither of them ever mentioned it. Stephen Sickman's body was found in Dean Coral's boat shed, but after remaining unidentified for 2 decades. In 1993, the body was misidentified as the body of Mark Scott, whose remains were likely buried on High Island Beach but were never found. In 2009, DNA testing confirmed that the body was in fact Stephen Sickman. His younger sister, Sandy, said, quote, "Learning about all this has been traumatic for me. I've been pushed back to being a 14-year-old girl looking for my brother. I found him, but not in a way I ever wanted to. I always thought I'd find a couple of nieces and nephews and bring Mama home some more grandbabies." On August the 21st, 1972, Coral abducted 19-year-old Roy Bunton, who was walking from his house to his shift at a shoe store near the newly established Northeast Mall. Once again, it's not likely either Brooks or Henley took part in this particular crime. Bunton was gagged, assaulted, and killed by 2 gunshots to the head. He was buried in the boat shed. However, his body was misidentified in 1973 as that of Billy Bolcher. His body was actually laid to rest by the Bolcher family under that name. In 2010, the body was exhumed, and in 2011, DNA testing confirmed that it was in fact the body of Roy Bunton. So if people are going out there and digging up all these graves and stuff and DNA testing people, why aren't they digging up that car park where they think there are even more victims? If they're still interested in doing this, it seems like a good idea to go and dig up like the backyards of the places he lived and the offices and the car parks and all that stuff. Why? What? Like, no? Just me? To like get some closure for the families? His remains were reinterred by the Bunton family in a private funeral. Billy Bolcher's body, which is said to have been buried on High Island Beach, has never been found. On October the 3rd, 1972, Coral and Brooks lured 14-year-old Wally Simoneau and 13-year-old Richard Hembry into Brooks's Corvette while the 2 boys were walking to a sleepover at Hembry's house. They were last seen sitting in the vehicle outside a grocery store by another friend who tried to speak to them, but Brooks got out of the car and menacingly told the friend to beat it. Thereafter, the boys were driven to Coral's apartment, and they were soon joined by Henley. Then, Coral, Brooks, and Henley enacted their usual MO. At some point in the evening, Coral attempted to force Wally Simoneau to call his mother to feed her a bogus story about his whereabouts, but a terrified Simoneau cried out, "Mother," and was immediately pulled away from the phone. His mother listened to some scuffling noises before the line went dead. She called Richard Hembry's mother and was told that the boys were very late and hadn't arrived yet. Wally Simoneau's mother immediately called the police. If the police are not like fucking on this shit extremely quickly, I'm gonna be extremely pissed off. At 7 a.m. the next morning, While Coral and Brooks were asleep, Henley resumed torturing the victims on his own. At some point, he put a gun in Richard Hembry's mouth to frighten the victim, and it accidentally went off, causing a severe but non-fatal exit wound in the boy's neck. Several hours later, Simon O. and Hembry were strangled, and that evening they were buried in Coral's boat shed. They're 13 and 14 years old, just a reminder. Sometime around November 1st, 1972, 18-year-old Willard Branch Jr. was hitchhiking between Mount Pleasant and Houston when he was picked up by Wayne Henley, who was driving without a license. Branch was invited to Coral's apartment to smoke some weed, where he was tricked into handcuffs. He was tortured, assaulted, and castrated before being shot in the head and buried at Southwest Boat Storage. His father, Willie Rusty Branch Sr., was an officer in the Houston police force who initiated a search to find his son. Finally. It has to hit close to home for the police to do something then, does it? However, the stresses of the situation caused Rusty Branch to drop dread of a heart attack only 3 weeks later, stopping the investigation in its tracks. Willard Branch Jr.'s remains were identified in 1985. If I was, I don't know, like if I know anything about cops and movies and from movies and stuff, if I was Willard Branch's partner, like they go out and do stuff together, right? I'd be like, wait, someone kidnapped his son, and then like, he died of a heart attack because of the stress of his son being kidnapped. I'd be like, that is my sole mission in life. Like, all I'm going to do as a policeman is track this down. That is just all I would do until I've dextered his fucking ass. On November 15th, 1972, Coral abducted Richard Kepner, a 19-year-old carpenter's apprentice, when he was walking to a phone booth to call his fiancée. He was subjected to the same tortures as the other victims. And
oh man, I'm like falling asleep. We'll finish this when I wake up. But yeah, thanks for stopping by and peace.